She is a financial parasite and an embarrassment to my name, Julian bellowed, his composure shattered, while he demanded a penniless divorce. I simply watched the clock. It was exactly 10:15 in the morning. Judge Mercer ignored his outburst, her eyes fixed on a new dossier. She leaned forward, piercing him with a cold stare. Mr. Thorne, you claim she is worthless, but do you realize who actually holds the deed to your entire empire? My name is Ellen Brookhart, and at this precise moment, I was being painted as the villain in the narrative of my own marriage. I sat with my hands folded neatly in my lap, feeling the rough texture of my wool skirt against my palms. It was a garment I had purchased at a thrift store 3 years ago, the fabric thinning at the knees and fraying slightly at the hem. It smelled of mothballs and old lavender, a sharp contrast to the scent of sandalwood and expensive leather that radiated from the man standing on the witness stand. Julian Thorne looked magnificent. There was no other word for it. He was wearing a custom navy suit, cut from Italian wool, tailored specifically to broaden his shoulders and trim his waist. The light from the high windows of the New York Supreme Court caught the subtle sheen of his silk tie. He looked like every inch the captain of industry, the CEO of Thorne Dynamics, the man who had supposedly revolutionized the tech industry. To the rest of the room, he was a titan. To me, he was a beautiful, hollow shell. "She is a parasite," Julian declared, his voice booming with a practiced baritone that he usually reserved for shareholder meetings. He gripped the railing of the witness stand, his knuckles white, performing his outrage for the benefit of the gallery. "I have worked 18 hours a day for the last 10 years to build Thorne Dynamics from a garage project into a global leader. And what has she done? What has Ellen done in all that time?" He paused for dramatic effect, sweeping his gaze across the courtroom before landing his eyes on me with a look of utter disdain. "She sat on the sofa." Julian spat the words out. "She spent my money. She complained that I worked too hard. She is not just lazy, Your Honor. She is intellectually vacant. She has no concept of what it takes to run a company, no understanding of finance, no ambition beyond her next shopping spree. She is an embarrassment to me, and she is an embarrassment to the Thorne name." I did not flinch. I did not look down. I simply watched his mouth move. I watched the way the veins in his neck bulged slightly when he raised his voice. I observed him with the detached curiosity of a scientist watching a specimen under a microscope. He was lying, of course. Every word was a fabrication constructed to strip me of my dignity before stripping me of my assets. But he told the lies with such conviction that I almost admired his performance. He actually believed his own rewriting of history. He had convinced himself that the ghost in the machine did not exist, that the code which ran his empire had appeared by magic, or perhaps by his own divine will. Beside me, the empty chair where a supportive friend or family member might sit felt large and cold. I was alone, or at least, that was how it appeared. My attorney, David, sat to my right, scribbling furiously on a legal pad, but I had instructed him to remain passive during this part of the testimony. We had to let Julian talk. We had to let him construct the trap himself. "Mr. Thorne," Judge Mercer spoke. Her voice was dry and raspy, like turning the pages of an old book. She was a woman of steel and statute, her gray hair pulled back in a severe bun. She did not seem impressed by Julian's suit or his volume. "You are stating that your wife made no contributions to the marriage whatsoever?" "None that were positive," Julian insisted. "She was a drain on my resources and my mental energy. A wife is supposed to be a partner." "Your Honor, Ellen was a dependent, a liability. I provided her with a lifestyle most women would kill for, and in return, she gave me nothing but apathy." I shifted slightly in my seat. The wooden bench was hard, and my lower back was beginning to ache. I looked at the clock on the wall. It was 10:20 in the morning. The market had been open for nearly an hour. The algorithms were running. The world outside this courtroom was moving at the speed of light, while in here, time seemed to hang heavy and thick, suffocated by the smell of floor wax and deceit. Julian's lawyer, Mr. Blackwood, stood up. He was a man who resembled a vulture in a pinstriped suit, with slicked back hair and a smile that never reached his eyes. He walked toward the judge's bench with a confident swagger, holding a thick binder. "Your Honor," Blackwood said, his voice oily and smooth. "To support my client's testimony, we would like to submit Exhibit C into evidence. These are credit card statements and receipts from the last 24 months. They demonstrate a pattern of reckless and frivolous spending by Mrs. Thorne, while my client was saving the company from quarter-to-quarter challenges. Mrs. Thorne was purportedly spending thousands of dollars on luxury spa treatments, designer handbags, and jewelry." I blinked. That was a nice touch. I had not bought a new handbag in 4 years. The one currently sitting at my feet was a canvas tote bag I got for free from a public library fundraiser. The spa treatments were likely charges Julian had hidden, or perhaps they were gifts for the woman sitting in the second row of the gallery. I turned my head slightly, just an inch, to look at her. Sophia Vane, the director of marketing at Thorne Dynamics. She was 26 years old, 20 years my junior, and she was glowing. She wore a cream-colored dress that fit her perfectly, and her hair fell in carefully styled waves over her shoulders. She caught my eye and offered a small, tight smile. It was not a smile of triumph. Exactly. It was worse. It was a smile of pity. She looked at my gray cardigan and my unpolished fingernails, and her eyes said, "You poor, sad old woman. You never stood a chance." She believed she was the winner. She believed she was the new queen of the castle. She had no idea that the castle was built on a fault line, and the earthquake had already started. I turned back to the front, inside my chest. There was no anger. That surprised me. 6 months ago, there had been anger. 6 months ago, when I first found the messages, when I first realized that my sacrifice meant nothing to him, there had been a fire hot enough to burn down the city. But that fire had burned itself out, leaving behind something much colder and much harder. I did not feel pain. I felt the eerie calm of a demolition expert watching the countdown timer reach 0. I was watching a child play with matches in a room full of gasoline. The child was my husband, and he was laughing as he struck the match, completely unaware of the fumes surrounding him. "I object to the characterization of Mrs. Thorne," David said softly, half rising from his chair. It was a token objection, one we knew would be overruled, but it was necessary for the record. "Overruled," Judge Mercer said, waving her hand dismissively. "I will review the financial documents. Continue, Mr. Thorne." Julian straightened his tie, emboldened by the judge's ruling. He looked directly at me now, his eyes cold and hard. "I am asking the court to enforce the prenuptial agreement strictly," Julian stated. "But more than that, I am asking for a ruling that denies her any claim to the appreciation of Thorne Dynamics' assets. She did not earn it. She does not deserve it. I want a clean break. I want her out of my life, out of my house, and out of my bank accounts. I am offering her a one-time settlement of $50,000 to help her get settled in a life more suited to her capabilities. Anything more would be charity." $50,000. That was less than the cost of the watch on his wrist. It was an insult designed to humiliate, to remind me that without him, I was nothing. He wanted to see me beg. He wanted to see me cry and plead for mercy so that he could feel benevolent by denying it. "And frankly," Julian added, twisting the knife, $50,000 is generous considering the emotional distress she has caused me with her incompetence. I have had to carry this marriage on my back just as I have carried the company. It is exhausting." The courtroom was silent. Even the court reporter seemed to pause for a second, struck by the sheer cruelty of his words. Julian stood there, radiating arrogance, waiting for applause that would never come. He thought he had won. He thought this was the end of the story. Judge Mercer took off her glasses. She rubbed the bridge of her nose, looking tired. Then, She reached for a new stack of files that the court clerk had just placed on her high desk. These were not the files Blackwood had submitted. These were the files David had subpoenaed and submitted only 10 minutes ago, timed perfectly to arrive just as Julian finished his diatribe. "So," Judge Mercer said, her voice low, "you are requesting a total severance of financial ties based on the premise that your wife has no financial literacy and contributed nothing to the creation of your wealth." 100% correct. "Your Honor," Julian said, nodding vigorously. The judge opened the file. It was a thick folder, bound in red. She flipped the first page, then the second. Her hand stopped. The indifference that had been on her face all morning vanished. Her eyebrows pulled together. She leaned closer to the paper, as if she could not believe what she was reading. She flipped another page, faster this time. Then she looked up. She did not look at Julian. She looked at the papers. Then she looked at me. For the first time all day, the judge really saw me. She saw past the gray cardigan and the tired eyes. She saw the numbers on the page, and she looked back at me with a mixture of confusion and dawning realization. The atmosphere in the room shifted instantly. It was as if the air pressure had dropped before a storm. The silence that followed was not the respectful silence of a courtroom. It was the heavy, suffocating silence of a predator entering a clearing. Judge Mercer looked back at Julian. Her expression had hardened. The boredom was gone, replaced by a sharp, dangerous focus. "Mr. Thorne," the judge said. Her voice was no longer dry. It was sharp, like a gavel striking wood. "You just stated under oath that your wife is, and I quote, intellectually vacant and has no concept of what it takes to run a company." "Yes, Your Honor," Julian said, though his voice faltered slightly. He sensed the shift, but he did not understand it. He was too blinded by his own ego to see the trap. "And you claim she is a burden," the judge continued, her eyes drilling into him, "that she is merely a consumer of your resources." "I do," Julian said, lifting his chin defiantly. "I am the sole creator of value in this relationship." Judge Mercer closed the file slowly. She rested her hands on top of it. She leaned forward over the bench, her gaze locking onto Julian with an intensity that made Blackwood shift uncomfortably in his seat. "Then explain to me, Mr. Thorne," the judge said, her voice echoing in the sudden stillness of the room. "If she is such a burden, and if you are the sole genius behind your empire, why does this financial audit indicate that you do not actually own the intellectual property rights to your own company?" Julian blinked. "Excuse me?" "I am looking at a series of patent registrations and copyright filings dating back 12 years, Judge Mercer said, tapping the file with her index finger. "And I am looking at a loan agreement authorized 3 months ago. You just called her an embarrassment. You just asked this court to leave her with nothing but $50,000. The judge paused, letting the words hang in the air like a guillotine blade. "Mr. Thorne?" she asked, her voice dropping to a whisper that carried to every corner of the room. "Do you have any idea who is actually sitting in this courtroom right now? Do you have any idea who you have been insulting for the last 20 minutes? Julian looked at the judge. Then he looked at his lawyer. Blackwood was frantically flipping through his own papers, his face draining of color. Then, slowly, Julian turned his head to look at me. I met his gaze. I did not smile. I did not frown. I simply adjusted my glasses and waited. The time was 10:25. The execution had begun. 6 months ago, the world was a different place. It was a place of suffocating velvet and blinding crystal, a cage disguised as a celebration. The event was the 10-year anniversary gala for Thorne Dynamics, held in the grand ballroom of the Pierre Hotel. The air smelled of expensive perfume and ambitious desperation. Waiters drifted through the crowd like ghosts, carrying trays of champagne that cost more than my first car. I stood in the shadow of a massive floral arrangement, gripping the stem of a glass I had not sipped from in an hour. My feet ached in heels that Julian had selected for me. He had chosen my dress as well, a muted beige gown that washed out my complexion and made me blend into the wallpaper. That was the point. I was meant to be present, but invisible, a prop to signal stability without drawing focus from the star of the show. Julian was in the center of the room. Surrounded by a circle of investors and tech journalists, he was holding court, his hands gesturing expansively as he recounted the origin story of the company. I could hear snippets of his voice drifting over the jazz music. He was telling them about the sleepless nights in our old apartment, the moment of epiphany when the architecture for the Oracle algorithm came to him in a dream. I closed my eyes for a second. It was not a dream. It was a Tuesday. I remembered it vividly. Julian had been asleep, snoring softly on the futon while I sat on the floor with 3 laptops humming around me, the heat from their processors warming my cold hands. I had been coding for 48 hours straight, fueled by instant coffee and a manic clarity that only came when I was deep in the math. I was the one who found the bridge between the predictive datasets. I was the one who wrote the kernel that night. When Julian woke up the next morning, I showed him the screen, my eyes burning with exhaustion, but my heart pounding with triumph. He had looked at it, confused at first, and then he had smiled. That smile was the reason I handed it all over to him. But standing in the ballroom, listening to him erase me from our history, I felt a familiar coldness settle in my chest. He caught my eye across the room. The smile vanished. He excused himself from his admirers and walked over to me, his grip on my elbow firm enough to bruise. "You are standing too close to the flowers." "Ellen," he hissed, his voice low and tight. "You look like you are hiding. Go circulate, but do not speak to the men from Sequoia Capital. Last time, you bored them with details they do not care about. Just smile, nod. If anyone asks what you do, tell them you are focusing on your charity work. Do not try to be smart. It is unbecoming." He patted my arm, a gesture that looked affectionate to an observer but felt like a dismissal to me. I watched him walk away, back to the light, back to the adoration. That night, I realized I was no longer his partner. I was an accessory that had gone out of style. The transition from partner to parasite had been slow, a gradual erosion of my identity. Before I was Mrs. Thorne, I was Ellen. I was a doctoral candidate in computational mathematics. I was a ghost coder for 3 major Silicon Valley startups, fixing the messes that their lead engineers could not solve. I lived in a world of pure logic, where variables could be controlled and outcomes could be predicted. I gave that up to build Julian. I stayed in the shadows because he needed the spotlight. He needed to be the visionary, and I was happy to be the engine. I thought we were a team. I thought his success was our success. I was wrong. The shattering of that illusion happened 2 weeks after the gala. It was a Tuesday again. I had returned home early from a grocery run because I had forgotten my wallet. The house was a sprawling modern mansion in the Hamptons, a place of glass and steel that felt more like a museum than a home. It was silent when I entered. I walked toward the study, intending to ask Julian if he had cash for the delivery tip. The door to the study was slightly ajar. I heard voices. One was Julian's, low and murmuring. The other was a woman's laughter, light and breathy. I recognized it immediately. Sophia Vane. She'd been at the gala, hanging on Julian's every word. I should have turned around. I should have made noise. Instead, I stepped closer. Through the gap in the door, I saw them. Julian was sitting in his leather executive chair, and Sophia was on the desk. It was a cliché so profound it almost made me laugh. But there was no laughter in my throat. There was only a sudden, sharp clarity. I did not barge in. I did not scream. I did not throw a vase. My heart rate did not even spike. Instead, my mind did what it always did in a crisis. It rebooted. It detached from the emotions that were trying to flood my system and went into diagnostic mode. I watched them for 10 seconds, cataloging the betrayal, and then I turned around and walked silently back to the kitchen. I paid the delivery driver with the emergency cash I kept in a cookie jar and sat at the kitchen island, staring at a bag of frozen peas. I realized then that the marriage was dead. The mourning period lasted exactly 45 minutes. Then, the mathematician took over. If the equation is broken, You do not cry over the numbers. You solve for X. That night, Julian went to bed early, complaining of a headache caused by the stress of managing the board. I waited until I heard the heavy, rhythmic breathing of deep sleep. At 2 o'clock in the morning, I slipped out of bed. I walked into the study. The scent of Sophia's perfume still lingered in the air, a cloying floral note that made me nauseous. I sat in his chair. I woke up his computer. He had changed his password recently. He thought he was clever. He had used the date of the company's IPO. I typed it in. Access granted. I did not look for love letters. I did not look for photos. I looked for the money. I plugged in an external hard drive and began to copy everything. Financial records, emails, chat logs, private memos. The progress bar on the screen moved agonizingly slow. 20%, 50%. I sat there in the dark, the blue light of the monitor reflecting in my glasses. A silent thief in my own house. For the next 3 weeks, I analyzed the data. I spent my days acting the part of the dutiful, dim-witted wife, and my nights dissecting the corpse of Thorne Dynamics. What I found was staggering. Julian was not just a cheater, he was a thief. He was siphoning money out of the company at an alarming rate. He had set up a shell company called Nebulous Holdings. Registered in the Cayman Islands, the transfers were disguised as consulting fees and marketing expenses. I traced the money. It flowed from Thorne Dynamics to Nebulous, and from Nebulous to a real estate developer in Miami. He was buying a waterfront villa. The deed was not in his name. It was in the name of a trust, and the sole beneficiary of that trust was Sophia Vane. He was building a life with her using the money generated by my algorithm. The tension in the house grew. Julian became shorter with me, more critical. He was projecting his guilt, turning it into aggression. The final fracture happened on a rainy Sunday morning. I had ordered a book online. It was a dense academic text on forensic accounting and advanced market dynamics. I needed it to understand the specific tax loopholes he was using. When the package arrived, Julian opened it. I walked into the living room to find him holding the book, a look of incredulous amusement on his face. "What is this?" he asked, tossing the heavy hardcover onto the coffee table. "Advanced macroeconomics? Since when do you read this sort of thing?" "Ellen, I am just interested," I said, keeping my voice neutral. "I want to understand more about the market." He laughed. It was a cruel, barking sound. "You want to understand the market? Ellen, you cannot even balance the household checkbook without asking me for help. Do not waste my money on books you will never read." "It is pathetic. You are trying to be something you are not. Stick to your gardening. Stick to planning menus. Leave the economics to the adults." He pulled out his phone. "I am cutting the limit on your supplementary credit card to $500 a month. Clearly, you have too much freedom if you are buying nonsense like this." He canceled the card right there in front of me. He stripped me of my financial autonomy with a few taps on a screen. He thought he was punishing a child. He did not know he was arming an enemy. I took the book. I went to my room. I read it cover to cover in 2 days. The end came a week later. I had found something in the ledgers that did not make sense. It was a massive liability column. A series of high-risk loans Julian had taken out to cover the cash flow gaps caused by his embezzlement. He was leveraging the company's future to pay for his present sins. We were at breakfast. He was reading the Wall Street Journal, ignoring my existence. "Julian," I said, testing the waters. "I saw a report on the desk about the Series B funding. Why is the debt-to-equity ratio so high? It looks like the company is over-leveraged by nearly 40%. He lowered the paper. The silence in the room was absolute. He looked at me, his face turning a shade of red that I had come to associate with danger. He stood up. He walked around the table until he was standing over me. I remained seated, refusing to cower. "Who gave you permission to look at my papers?" he asked, his voice shaking with rage. "I just saw it." I said, "It concerns me. If the interest rates go up, the liquidity could—" He slammed his hand down on the table. The silverware rattled. "Shut up," he shouted. "Just shut up. You stupid, ignorant woman. You know nothing. You think because you read one book you are an analyst? That debt is strategic. It is complex financial structuring that your tiny brain could not possibly comprehend. He leaned down, his face inches from mine. I could smell the coffee on his breath. You are nothing. Ellen, you are a decoration. You are a burden. Without me, you would be starving in a gutter. Do not ever question me again. Do not ever speak to me about my business again. If you do, I will throw you out of this house with nothing but the clothes on your back. Do you understand? He did not hit me. He did not have to. His words were a slap that echoed in my soul. He had stripped me of my intellect, my contribution, and my dignity. He looked at me with pure loathing, as if I were a stain on his perfect life. I looked back at him. In that moment, the last thread of affection snapped. The woman who loved him died in that chair. The woman who stood up was someone else entirely. I understand. Julian, I said softly. I understand perfectly. He sneered, satisfied that he had put me back in my place. He grabbed his briefcase and stormed out of the house. I watched his car disappear down the driveway. I did not cry. I went upstairs to the guest room, pulled a suitcase from the closet, and packed my old laptop. I had all the data I needed. He had called me a burden. He had called me ignorant. He had dared me to survive without him. I sat on the edge of the bed and dialed a number I had not called in 10 years. It was the number of a man named Marcus, my old mentor, the only person in the world who knew that I was the one who wrote the code that changed the world. It is me, I said when he answered. I am ready to come back to work. But first, I have a project I need to finish. I need to kill a company. The plan formed in my mind, complete and perfect. It was not a plan for revenge. Revenge is messy and emotional. This was a correction. It was an equation that needed to be balanced. Julian Thorne had stolen my life, my work, and my pride. I was going to take them back, dollar by dollar, share by share. The memories faded as the courtroom came back into focus. I blinked. The image of Julian's angry face at the breakfast table replaced by his confused face on the witness stand. He was still looking at me, waiting for me to crumble under the weight of his public humiliation. He had no idea that the woman he was trying to destroy had already burned to ash 6 months ago, and the thing sitting in front of him was the fire that would consume him, 3 months before the trial. I sat in a high-back leather chair in a private library in Greenwich, Connecticut. The room smelled of old paper and expensive cognac. Across from me sat Marcus Sterling, a man whose name appeared on no Forbes list, but whose influence ran through the veins of Wall Street like a quiet, potent poison. He was 70 years old, with eyes that had seen every market crash since the 70s and profited from all of them. He was my mentor, the man who had recognized my genius when I was a 22-year-old grad student, and the only person alive who knew the truth about the code. You look different. Ellen, Marcus said, placing a cup of tea in front of me. You look dangerous. I am not dangerous, I replied, picking up the porcelain cup. I am simply efficient, and I need a favor. I did not come to him for sympathy. I came to him for infrastructure. Marcus was the silent chairman of Aurelius Capital, a venture capital firm that specialized in distressed assets and hostile takeovers. They were sharks, but they were sharks with etiquette. I laid out the situation for him. I did not tell him about the heartbreak or the betrayal with Sophia. Those were emotional variables, and they were irrelevant to the business at hand. I told him about the numbers. I told him about the liquidity crisis at Thorne Dynamics, the embezzlement, and the massive hole in the balance sheet where $50 million should have been. Marcus listened, tapping his finger against his chin. When I finished, he smiled. It was a wolfish expression. So, the prodigy wants to eat her creator, he mused. Julian is not my creator. I corrected him sharply. I created him. I wrote the code. I built the architecture. I even designed the logo on a napkin. He just wore the suits and took the credit. And now you want to take it back, Marcus said. No, I said, I do not want to take it back. I want to liquidate it. I want to strip him of everything he thinks he owns until he is left with nothing but his arrogance. To do this, I needed a vehicle. I could not buy Julian's debt under my own name. He would never sign the papers. I needed a mask. We established a shell company that afternoon. We registered it in Zurich, Switzerland, under the strictest privacy laws. We named it B. Holdings. It was a simple, nondescript name. To the casual observer, it sounded like just another boring European investment firm. To me, it was a signature. E.B. Ellen Brookhart. I was hiding in plain sight, daring him to see me. The next step was the bait. Julian was bleeding money. My late-night audit of his computer had revealed that he was burning through cash to maintain Sophia's lifestyle and cover the losses from his bad management decisions. He was desperate for a cash injection to keep the stock price inflated before the quarterly earnings report. He had been rejected by the major banks because his credit rating was quietly tanking. He was vulnerable. I had Marcus reach out to him through an intermediary, a slick broker named Silas, who knew how to sell ice to an Eskimo. Silas presented Holdings as a private equity firm looking for a high-potential partner in the American tech sector. We offered to buy out his short-term high-interest debt and replace it with a single, massive loan of $50 million. The interest rate we offered was suspiciously low. Almost too good to be true, but there was a catch. There is always a catch. The loan agreement was 150 pages long. It was a labyrinth of legal jargon, subordinate clauses, and cross-references. I wrote the terms myself. I spent 3 nights crafting sentences that looked standard but acted like landmines. The most important weapon was the intellectual property clause. Julian believed he owned the oracle, the algorithm that powered his company. He believed it because he had been using it for 10 years. But he had forgotten the beginning. He had forgotten the contract we signed a decade ago, back when we were just starting, back when he was paranoid about investors stealing our work. At that time, to protect us, I had registered the copyright for the source code under my maiden name, Ellen Vance. Then, I had executed a licensing agreement granting Thorne Dynamics the exclusive right to use the code for exactly 10 years. I had set the expiration date to coincide with our 10th wedding anniversary, thinking it would be a romantic renewal, a symbolic gesture of our decade of partnership. That date was yesterday. Julian had never renewed the license. He had likely never even read the original paperwork. Or if he had, he assumed that since we were married. What was mine was his. He was wrong. The contract was specific, the license was non-transferable and expired automatically without notice. The new loan agreement from EB Holdings contained a specific clause, Section 14, Paragraph B, which stated that the borrower, Thorne Dynamics, warranted that it held full, unencumbered ownership of all core intellectual property. By signing the loan, Julian was committing fraud. He was claiming to own something that actually belonged to the ghost he had left at home. The second weapon was the reputation clause. It stated that if the CEO engaged in any public behavior that damaged the reputation of the lender, the loan would be considered in default, and the full amount would become due immediately. Since ELB Holdings was me, any insult he threw at me in public would trigger the clause. We set the trap. Now we just had to wait for him to step into it. I monitored the signing meeting via a listening device Silas had placed in the conference room. I sat in my small rented apartment, wearing headphones, listening to my husband sell his soul. I could hear the clink of crystal glasses. Julian was drinking scotch. It was 11 o'clock in the morning. "This E.B. Holdings," Julian said, his voice booming with false bravado. "Who are they exactly? Some Swiss retirees looking to park their pension funds? They are a very private group." "Mr. Thorne," Silas replied smoothly, "they admire your work. They see Thorne Dynamics as a sleeping giant." Julian laughed. "A sleeping giant. I like that. Much better than the vultures at Chase Bank. They wanted to audit my personal spending. Can you believe the nerve?" I typed a command on my laptop, adjusting the volume. I wanted to hear every scratch of the pen. "Mr. Blackwood," Julian's lawyer, spoke up. "Julian, I should really take a few days to review the finer points of this agreement. The default clauses in Section 12 seem a bit aggressive. I held my breath. If Blackwood did his job, if he actually read the document, the game was over. He would see the trap. But Julian was impatient. He was greedy. And he was arrogant. "Don't be a coward." "Blackwood," Julian snapped, "look at the interest rate. It is 3%. If we wait, the offer might be withdrawn. These Europeans are fickle. Besides, look at the name. E.B. Holdings. What does that stand for? Early birds? Easy banking?" He chuckled at his own joke. "It probably stands for everybody," Julian continued, "because everyone wants a piece of me right now. Just give me the pen. I know what I'm doing. I have run this company for 10 years without your hand-holding. I heard the scratch of the pen on paper. It was a beautiful sound, louder to me than a symphony." Julian Thorne had just signed his death warrant. "Congratulations, Mr. Thorne," Silas said. "The funds will be wired to your account within the hour." "Excellent," Julian said. "Now, get out. I have a lunch reservation." I took off the headphones. I felt a surge of adrenaline, cold and electric. Step 1 was complete. He had taken the money. He was now legally bound to EB Holdings. He was legally bound to me, but I was not done. I wanted to surround him. I wanted to make sure that when the walls fell, they fell inward, crushing him completely. I used the remaining capital in the war chest Marcus had allocated to me to launch a secondary offensive. I looked at the map of the office park where Thorne Dynamics was headquartered. The company owned the main building, a gleaming glass tower, but they leased the surrounding land. They leased the parking structure. They leased the warehouse that housed their server farm. I contacted the real estate holding company that owned those lots. I made an offer they could not refuse, paying 20% above market value. Within 2 weeks, through another shell company called Vance Properties, I owned the ground beneath Julian's feet. I owned the servers that stored his data. I owned the pavement where he parked his Ferrari. I was literally closing in on him, tightening the noose with every acre I acquired. One afternoon, a week after the signing, I drove past the office. I saw Julian walking out of the building with Sophia. He looked confident, revitalized by the $50 million he had just received. He had his hand on her waist, and they were laughing. He looked like a man who had gotten away with murder. He did not know that the European investors he was toasting were actually the wife he had called a burden. He did not know that the early birds were actually a vulture circling overhead. I went back to my apartment and opened my laptop. I pulled up the dashboard for the Thorne Dynamics server network, because I had written the original code. I still had a backdoor administrative key. I had never used it, respecting the boundaries of our professional relationship, but those boundaries no longer existed. I logged in. I did not change anything. I simply set up a monitor. I wanted to see where the new money was going. It did not take long. Within 48 hours, $2 million was transferred from the corporate operating account to the nebulous trust in the Caymans. He was doing it again. He was stealing the money I had just lent him to pay for the villa he was building for his mistress. I saved the transaction log. It was another nail in the coffin. I sat back and watched the screen. The green lines of code cascaded down, the heartbeat of the company I had built. I felt a strange sense of intimacy with the machine. The Oracle was my child, and Julian had been abusing it. He had been using its brilliance to fund his mediocrity. I reached out and touched the screen. "Soon," I whispered. "Soon you will come home." The phone rang. It was Marcus. "The land deal is closed," he said. "You now own the server farm. We can evict them with 30 days' notice if we want to." "Not yet," I said. "Let him get comfortable. Let him spend the money. Let him think he is safe. The divorce hearing is in 3 months. That is when we pull the plug." "You are a cold woman." "Ellen," Marcus said, and I could hear the admiration in his voice. "I learned from the best." I replied. I hung up the phone. Outside, it started to rain. I watched the drops streak against the window, distorting the city lights. Julian was probably at dinner with Sophia right now, ordering a bottle of wine that cost more than my monthly rent. boasting about how he had secured funding and saved the company. He was living in a fantasy world, and I was the author of the final chapter. 1 month ago, Julian came home with a bottle of Dom Perignon in one hand and a manila envelope in the other. He kicked the front door open, striding into the hallway with the energy of a conquering general returning to Rome. I was sitting in the living room, folding laundry. It was a mundane task, one that fit the role he had assigned to me, the domestic shadow, the silent operator of the washing machine. He tossed the envelope onto the coffee table. It slid across the polished wood and came to a stop against a stack of Architectural Digest magazines. "Happy Tuesday." "Ellen," he said, his voice loud and booming. He set the champagne down next to the envelope. "I am celebrating, and since you are still technically living here, I suppose you should know why." I folded a towel and placed it neatly on the pile. I did not look at the champagne. I looked at the envelope. It was thick, legal thick. "Is that what I think it is?" I asked. "If you think it is your ticket to freedom, then yes," Julian said, loosening his tie. "Those are the divorce papers. My lawyers finally drafted something that is fair to me." He walked over to the wet bar and began to uncork the bottle. The cork popped with a sharp report. Like a gunshot in the quiet house, "I have secured the funding." "Ellen," he announced, pouring the foaming liquid into a crystal flute. He did not offer me a glass. $50 million. Can you imagine that number? Of course you cannot. It is more money than you could spend in 10 lifetimes of buying discount sweaters. He took a long sip, closing his eyes in pleasure. "Aurelius Capital came through," he continued, "and a new player, E.B. Holdings, a Swiss firm, very exclusive. They recognized my genius immediately. They did not ask about my wife. They did not ask about my personal life. They just looked at the company, saw the potential of the man at the helm, and wrote the check. That is how business works. Ellen, real players recognize real players." I had to bite the inside of my cheek to keep from laughing. The irony was so rich it was almost choking me. He was standing there, drinking expensive wine, toasting the brilliance of E.B. Holdings, completely unaware that E.B. stood for Ellen Brookhart. He was toasting his own executioner. He picked up the envelope and tapped it with his finger. "I want you to sign these tonight," he said. "I am done waiting. Sophia and I are moving forward. She is organizing a rebranding gala for the company next month. She is going to be the face of the new Thorne dynamics. She has style. Ellen, she has grace. She fits the image of a billionaire's wife. You have always been more comfortable in the background." I reached for the envelope. I opened it and pulled out the document. It was brutal. It stipulated that I would receive no alimony, no shares in the company, and no claim to the marital home. It offered a lump sum of $50,000, framed as a relocation assistance gift. I scanned the pages. Julian watched me, a smirk playing on his lips. He expected me to cry. He expected me to throw the papers at him, to scream about my 10 years of sacrifice, to demand half of everything. He was ready for a fight. He wanted a fight because destroying me in an argument would make him feel powerful. I disappointed him. I picked up a pen from the table. "I will sign," I said quietly. Julian blinked. His smirk faltered for a second. "Just like that? You are not going to whine about your rights? I realized a long time ago that fighting you is a waste of energy." "Julian," I lied, "I just want to move on. I want a simple life." He laughed, a harsh, barking sound. "See? That is exactly why we do not work. You have no fight in you, no ambition. You are a doormat." "Ellen," he walked over and looked over my shoulder as I turned to the final page. "However," I said, pausing with the pen hovering over the signature line, "I have one condition." Julian rolled his eyes. "Here it comes. You want the beach house? You want the Jaguar?" "Forget it. No," I said. "I do not want your houses or your cars." I added a handwritten note to the bottom of the asset division schedule. "I want to keep my personal effects, my books, my old computer equipment in the basement, the contents of my private storage unit, and any intellectual property registered under my maiden name prior to the marriage. Julian squinted at my handwriting. He read the words out loud, his voice dripping with mockery. Old computer equipment? You mean that junk you used in college? And what intellectual property? Your thesis on what was it? Theoretical algorithms? He laughed again, shaking his head. Ellen, if you want to keep your trash, be my guest. I was going to pay someone to haul it to the dump anyway. You are saving me the disposal fee. He did not even pause to consider what intellectual property registered under my maiden name might include. He did not think about the copyright for the Oracle. In his mind, anything I created was worthless by definition. He signed his initials next to my note with a flourish. Done, he said. You can take your scrap metal and your little math papers. Just be out of the house by the end of the month. I signed my name, Ellen Brookhart. The ink was dark and permanent. Excellent, Julian said, snatching the papers away as soon as I finished. I will have Blackwood file these tomorrow. You are making the right choice. Ellen, you were never cut out for this altitude. He finished his champagne in one gulp and headed for the door. Where are you going? I asked. To celebrate, he said without looking back. Sophia is waiting for me at Le Bernardin. We are going to toast to the future, a future without dead weight. He left me alone in the living room. I sat there for a moment, listening to the silence. Then, I stood up and walked to the window. I watched his taillights fade into the darkness. Enjoy your dinner, Julian, I whispered. It is the last meal you will ever enjoy. 2 days later, the celebration expanded. Julian did not just take Sophia to dinner. He threw a party. He rented the rooftop of the Standard Hotel. He invited the entire executive board, the top investors, and a flock of influencers Sophia had befriended. I did not attend. Of course, I was the ex-wife, the dead weight that had been cut loose. But I saw everything. Sophia documented every moment on social media. I sat in my new, modest apartment, a place I had rented using funds from my Swiss account, and scrolled through her feed on my phone. There was a photo of them clinking glasses, with the caption, New Beginnings with the Visionary himself, Power Couple Thorne Dynamics. There was a video of Julian giving a speech. He looked flushed and manic. To E.B. Holdings, he shouted to the cheering crowd. To the partners who believe in innovation, we are going to double our market cap in 6 months. I zoomed in on the bottle of champagne in his hand. It was a vintage Cristal. Price tag, $600. He was spraying it over the crowd like it was water. Then I saw the post that made my blood run cold. It was a selfie of Sophia in the bathroom mirror. She was wearing a diamond necklace. I recognized it. It was my grandmother's necklace. Julian had told me it was lost during our move 3 years ago. He had lied. He had stolen it and given it to his mistress. The caption read, Out with the old, in with the gold. Finally, someone who knows how to wear real jewelry. Upgrade. I stared at the screen. My grandmother had worn that necklace when she fled Europe during the war. It was the only thing she had left. And now, it was draped around the neck of a woman who thought struggle meant waiting 10 minutes for a valet. I put the phone down. I did not throw it. I placed it gently on the table. Okay, I said to the empty room. Playtime is over. I opened my laptop. I logged into the secure portal for EB Holdings. I navigated to the loan administration panel. There was a button labeled Initiate Field Audit. According to the contract Julian had signed, without reading, the lender had the right to send a team of forensic accountants to the borrower's premises at any time, without prior notice, to verify the health of the collateral. I clicked the button. The next morning, at 9 o'clock sharp, 5 men in gray suits walked into the lobby of Thorne Dynamics. They were not my employees. They were contractors from a top-tier firm I had hired through Marcus. They were the best in the business. They were bloodhounds. I was on a video call with the lead auditor, a man named Mr. Sterling. No relation to Marcus, just a happy coincidence. He wore a hidden earpiece, and I could hear everything. Mr. Thorne is not expecting us. The receptionist stammered. We do not require an appointment, Mr. Sterling said calmly, flashing his credentials. We are representing the primary lien holder, EB Holdings. We are here to conduct a compliance audit. Please show us to the server room and the finance department. Julian came storming out of his office 5 minutes later. I could hear his voice through the audio feed. What is the meaning of this? He demanded. Who are you people? Mr. Sterling explained the situation. Julian's reaction was classic. He laughed. An audit? Now? Julian chuckled. You Europeans are so bureaucratic. Fine. Do whatever you need to do. Just do not get in the way of my creative team. We are building the future here. He waved his hand dismissively. He thought it was a formality. He thought they were just checking boxes. He did not realize they were not there to check boxes. They were there to follow the money trail to the Cayman Islands. Make yourselves at home, Julian said. And hey, tell the partners at EB Holdings that I'm buying a new yacht next week. Maybe they want to come for a ride. He walked away, whistling. I spoke into my microphone. Mr. Sterling, prioritize the marketing expense accounts and cross-reference them with the shell company Nebulous. Understood, Mr. Sterling replied. For the next 3 weeks, the auditors tore the company apart from the inside. They were polite, quiet, and absolutely ruthless. They copied hard drives. They interviewed junior accountants. They mapped every single dollar that flowed in and out of the building. Julian ignored them. He was too busy planning his wedding to Sophia. He treated the auditors like furniture, but the tension in the office was building. The employees knew something was wrong. They whispered in the break rooms. They saw the grim faces of the men in gray suits, and then it happened. The event that removed the last shred of hesitation from my heart. It was a Friday afternoon. I was monitoring the internal security cameras, another access point I had retained. I saw a commotion in the hallway outside Julian's office. Mr. Abernathy was standing there. Mr. Abernathy was 60 years old. He was the lead archivist for the company. He had been with us since the garage days. He was the one who kept the servers running when the cooling systems failed. He was a kind man who brought donuts on Fridays and asked about my garden. He was holding a stack of files. He looked distressed. Mr. Thorne, I heard Abernathy say, I cannot sign off on these expense reports. These are not business expenses. This is renovation work for a private residence in Miami. Julian stepped out of his office. He looked annoyed. Just sign it, Abernathy. Julian snapped. It is creative accounting. Everyone does it. I cannot, Abernathy said, his voice shaking. It is illegal, Julian, and it is disrespectful to the investors. It is disrespectful to Ellen. She built this place on integrity. The hallway went silent. The mention of my name was like a curse word. Julian's face turned purple. He stepped forward and shoved the old man. The files scattered across the floor. Ellen? Julian shouted. You are bringing up Ellen? She is a nobody. She is history. And you know what? So are you. Julian pointed a shaking finger at the exit. You are fired. Abernathy. Get out. Get your things and get out of my building before I call security to throw you out. But my pension. Abernathy stammered. I am 2 months away from retirement. I do not care about your pension. Julian screamed. I care about loyalty. And you clearly do not have it. You are fired for gross insubordination. That means no severance, no pension, nothing. Now get out of my sight. Sophia appeared in the doorway of her office. She was leaning against the frame, filing her nails. Bye-bye, Grandpa, she called out. Take your dusty morals with you. I watched Mr. Abernathy kneel down to pick up his glasses, which had fallen in the scuffle. He looked small and broken. No one helped him. The other employees looked down at their desks, terrified. Julian kicked one of the files across the floor. Pathetic, he muttered, and slammed his door shut. I sat in my chair, staring at the screen. My hands were trembling, not with fear, but with a cold, concentrated rage. You should not have done that. Julian, I said to the screen, you really should not have done that. I picked up my phone and called Mr. Sterling. Status report. I said, we have everything. Mrs. Brookhart? Sterling replied. "The evidence of embezzlement is irrefutable. We have traced over $8 million in misappropriated funds, and we have found the breach of the IP clause." "Good," I said. "Pack up. We are done." "Are we filing a report with the SEC?" Sterling asked. "Not yet," I said. "I want to look him in the eye when I do it." I hung up. I reached into my desk drawer and pulled out a small, velvet box. Inside was a flash drive containing the compiled evidence. I closed the box and snapped it shut. Julian thought he was a god because he had money. He did not understand that money was just energy, and energy could be redirected. He had treated people like disposable tools. He had thrown away Mr. Abernathy like a used wrapper. He had made it personal. I stood up and walked to the calendar on the wall. I circled the date of the divorce hearing. It was 1 week away. The washed-up old auntie, as Sophia had called me, was about to teach them a lesson in relevance. I looked at the mirror. I did not see a victim. I saw the CEO of EB Holdings. I saw the owner of Thorne Dynamics. And I saw the woman who was about to bring the sky crashing down. The stage was set. The players were in position. The trap was primed. "See you in court, husband." The echo of Julian's shout hung in the courtroom like the reverberation of a gunshot. "She is an embarrassment." The words bounced off the mahogany panels and settled into the dust of the carpet. He stood on the witness stand, chest heaving, his face flushed with the exertion of his own performance. He looked like a man who had just spiked a football in the end zone. Unaware that the game had ended 10 minutes ago and he was cheering for the wrong team, the courtroom remained frozen in a state of suspended animation. The court stenographer's fingers hovered over her keys. The gallery, filled with a mix of bored legal interns and gossip-hungry reporters, leaned forward collectively. They smelled blood. They just did not know whose blood it was yet. I sat perfectly still. My hands were clasped loosely in my lap. I did not look at Julian. I did not look at Sophia, who was currently checking her manicure in the second row. I looked at my lawyer. David stood up, to the untrained eye. David looked like a mistake. He was 27 years old, with messy brown hair that refused to stay combed, and a suit that was half a size too big for his lanky frame. He looked like an intern who had gotten lost on his way to the copy room. This was intentional. I had chosen David precisely because he looked harmless. Julian was a man who feasted on confrontation. If I had hired a shark in a $3,000 suit, Julian would have been on guard. But David? Julian looked at David and saw an insect. Julian sneered as David approached the bench. He adjusted his silk tie, his body language screaming dismissal. He was ready to crush this boy. David stopped a few feet from the witness stand. He did not look angry. He looked confused, scratching the back of his head with a pen. "Mr. Thorne," David began, his voice soft and unassuming. "You have painted a very vivid picture of your marriage. You claim my client, Mrs. Thorne, is a financial burden, that she is, in your words, a parasite." "I speak only the truth," Julian replied, leaning into the microphone. "She has not earned $1 in 10 years. I have paid for every meal she has eaten and every stitch of clothing on her back." David nodded slowly, as if absorbing this profound wisdom. "Right, of course, and because she contributed nothing, you feel justified in offering her a settlement that amounts to less than 1% of your net worth." "It is not about the percentage," Julian said, waving his hand dismissively. "It is about merit. Why should she be rewarded for laziness? The $50,000 is a gift. I am being charitable." David flipped a page on his legal pad. He looked down, squinting at his own handwriting. "Let us talk about merit then," David said, "and let us talk about the company, Thorne Dynamics. You stated earlier that you are the sole architect of its success." "I am," Julian said. "I built it from the ground up." "And the company is doing well?" David asked. "Financially speaking?" Julian puffed out his chest. "We are stronger than ever. We just closed a major funding round. We are poised to dominate the market." David looked up. His eyes, usually hidden behind thick glasses, were suddenly sharp. The confused intern vanished. The legal assassin appeared. if the company is doing so well. Mr. Thorne, why is the debt structure so unusual? Julian blinked. Excuse me? David took a step closer. I'm looking at the public filings. 3 months ago, Thorne Dynamics was rejected by Chase, Citibank, and Wells Fargo for a standard line of credit. Your credit rating was downgraded to junk status due to cash flow irregularities. Is that correct? Julian's jaw tightened. That is a misinterpretation of standard market fluctuations. Banks are conservative dinosaurs. They do not understand tech. So you went to alternative lenders. David pressed. You secured a loan of $50 million from a private equity firm called EB Holdings. Julian rolled his eyes. He looked at Judge Mercer with an expression of long-suffering patience. Your Honor, is this relevant? My company's financing has nothing to do with my wife's inability to hold a job. It goes to the question of assets and liabilities. Judge Mercer said. Her voice was cool, detached. Answer the question. Mr. Thorne. Fine, Julian spat. Yes, we secured funding from EB Holdings. They are a visionary firm based in Switzerland. They saw the value in what I was building. Unlike my wife, they understand potential. And are you aware of the specific terms of that loan agreement? David asked. Specifically, the clauses regarding the collateral? Julian laughed. It was a dry, condescending sound. I have a team of lawyers for that. Son, I do not waste my time reading the fine print. I focus on the big picture. So you are not aware that the loan is callable immediately upon the breach of certain covenants? David asked. Julian leaned forward, his patience evaporating. Listen to me, you little ambulance chaser. The loan is solid. The company is solid. The only thing that is fragile here is your client's grasp on reality. David did not flinch. He did not retreat. He simply stood there, waiting. Julian, sensing that he had not crushed the boy sufficiently, decided to go for the kill. He turned his attention back to the judge. Your Honor, this line of questioning is a distraction. This is exactly what Ellen does. She creates chaos to hide her own inadequacy. She has been doing this for years. Honestly, I believe she is suffering from some form of delusional disorder. A ripple of murmurs went through the courtroom. Julian's lawyer, Mr. Blackwood, stiffened in his seat. He knew that attacking the opposing party's mental health without evidence was a risky move. But Julian was off the leash now. She has these fantasies, Julian continued, tapping his temple. She thinks she is smarter than she is. She sits in the basement with her old computers and pretends to be working on important things. It is sad. Really. I have tried to get her help. I have offered to pay for a therapist. But she refuses. She lives in a power fantasy where she is the victim and I am the villain. He pointed a finger at me. Look at her. Sitting there like a stone. She is not all there. She needs psychiatric supervision, not a divorce settlement. I am asking the court to order a mental health evaluation. For her own safety. I felt a cold smile touch the corners of my lips. It was barely visible. But Julian saw it. It made him pause for a fraction of a second. Judge Mercer slammed her gavel down. The sound cracked through the room like a whip. That is enough. Mr. Thorne, the judge said. Her voice was no longer detached. It was hard. You will limit your testimony to the facts. Personal attacks on the respondent will not be tolerated in my courtroom. I am just trying to give you the context, Julian argued, though he shrank back slightly under the judge's glare. You need to understand who you are dealing with. She is a nobody, a zero. Judge Mercer ignored him. She reached for the document that David had placed on her bench earlier. It was the red file, the file that contained the truth about EB Holdings, the file that contained the copyright registrations. She put her glasses back on. She opened the folder. The room went silent. The only sound was the rustle of paper as the judge turned a page. She read the first paragraph. Then she read the second. Her eyes widened slightly. She looked up at David, who gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. She looked at Julian. Mr. Thorne, Judge Mercer said. Her tone had changed completely. It was quiet, dangerous. The boredom was gone. She looked like a hunter who had just spotted a trap snapping shut on a wolf's leg. Yes. Your Honor? Julian asked, straightening his jacket. He thought he had won the argument. He thought the judge was about to lecture David for wasting the court's time. I want to be absolutely clear about your position, the judge said. She rested her hands on the open file. You have stated, under oath, that your wife contributed nothing to the creation of Thorne Dynamics. 0, Julian said confidently. You have stated that she has no financial literacy, none, and you have stated that she has no intellectual property claims, no patents, and no ownership of any trade secrets used by your company. Julian laughed again. Your Honor, Ellen cannot even program the microwave clock. She certainly does not own any trade secrets. The intellectual property of Thorne Dynamics belongs to Thorne Dynamics, and since I am the founder, it belongs to me. Judge Mercer looked down at the paper again. She traced a line of text with her finger. And you are certain, beyond a shadow of a doubt, that she has no independent income? That she is, as you said, a parasite? 100% certain. Julian said. He looked at the gallery and winked at Sophia. She is penniless. If I stopped paying the bills today, she would be on the street tomorrow. Judge Mercer closed the file. She did not close it gently. She let the heavy cover fall with a thud. She leaned forward. The bench seemed to loom over Julian. Mr. Thorne, do you know what the penalty for perjury is in the state of New York? Julian frowned. I am not committing perjury. I am telling you the facts. The judge picked up a single sheet of paper from the file. She held it up. It was a document with a gold seal at the bottom. This is a certified copy of a copyright registration from the United States Patent and Trademark Office. The judge said, It is dated 12 years ago. Julian looked confused. So, what does that have to do with me? The title of the registered work is The Oracle, Predictive Algorithm, Kernel Source Code. The judge read. Julian's face went blank. That is my algorithm. That is the core of my company. Is it? The judge asked. Because according to this document, the author and sole owner of the copyright is not Julian Thorne, nor is it Thorne Dynamics. She paused. The silence in the room was absolute. It was a vacuum, sucking the air out of Julian's lungs. The owner is Ellen Vance, the judge said, which I believe is your wife's maiden name. Julian opened his mouth, but no sound came out. He looked like a fish pulled out of water. And this, the judge continued, picking up another document, is a licensing agreement between Ellen Vance and Thorne Dynamics. It granted your company the right to use this code for a period of 10 years. She looked at the date on the paper. It expired yesterday, the judge said. Julian gripped the railing of the witness stand. His knuckles were white. No, he stammered. That is a mistake. That is just paperwork. We are married. It does not matter. It matters very much. Mr. Thorne, the judge said, because if this contract is valid, then as of midnight last night, your company is operating its core product illegally. You are stealing intellectual property. That is ridiculous, Julian shouted, his composure cracking. She is my wife. She gave it to me. Did she? The judge asked. She looked at me. Mrs. Thorne, did you gift this intellectual property to the company in perpetuity? I stood up slowly. I smoothed the front of my skirt. I looked Julian in the eye. No, Your Honor. I said clearly. My voice was steady, contrasting with Julian's rising panic. I did not gift it. I licensed it, and I have decided not to renew the license. Julian stared at me. His eyes were wide with shock. It was the first time in 10 years he had actually looked at me and seen a threat. You cannot do that, he whispered. That is my company. It is my code, I replied. Judge Mercer cleared her throat. But that is not all. Mr. Thorne, she picked up the thickest document in the file, the loan agreement. You mentioned earlier that you secured $50 million from a Swiss firm called EB Holdings. You called them visionaries. Julian nodded dumbly. Yes, and you said you did not read the fine print because you have lawyers for that. Blackwood, Julian's lawyer, had his face buried in his hands. He was shaking his head slowly. He knew. He had finally put the pieces together. The judge turned to the signature page. "Mr. Thorne, do you know who the managing director of EB Holdings is?" Julian shook his head. "No, it is a private equity firm." The judge turned the document around so that the signature page faced the witness stand. She pointed to a line at the bottom. "The authorized signatory for EB Holdings is right here," the judge said. Julian squinted. He leaned forward. He read the name. E.B. Ellen Brookhart. The color drained from his face so fast it looked like the blood had been siphoned out of him. He staggered back a step, hitting the chair behind him. "No," he gasped. "That is impossible. She has no money. She buys clothes at Goodwill." "Apparently," the judge said dryly. "She is a very frugal billionaire." The courtroom exploded. The gallery erupted into noise. Reporters were typing furiously on their phones. Sophia stood up in the second row, her mouth hanging open, her eyes darting between Julian and me. Judge Mercer banged her gavel, but her heart was not in it. She was enjoying this. "Order, order," she called out. But she kept her eyes on Julian. Julian looked at me. The arrogance was gone. The contempt was gone. In their place was pure, unadulterated terror. He realized, in that split second, that he was not the king of the castle. He was a tenant, and the landlord had just served him an eviction notice. "You set me up," Julian whispered hoarsely. "I did not set you up. Julian," I said, my voice cutting through the noise. "I simply let you be yourself." And then, the phone started ringing. Not just one phone, dozens of them. The chirp of notifications rippled through the gallery. "Mr." Blackwood's phone vibrated on the table. He looked at it. His face turned gray. "Your Honor," Blackwood said, his voice trembling, "I have just received an automated notification." "What is it?" "Counselor," the judge asked. "The trading of Thorne Dynamics stock has been halted," Blackwood said. "The system has locked out all users. The algorithm has shut down." Julian gripped his chest. "What?" "And," Blackwood continued, looking at me with fear in his eyes, "we have received a notice of default from the primary lender. E.B. Holdings has called the loan. They are demanding immediate repayment of the full $50 million. Julian fell back into the witness chair. He looked small. He looked broken. I sat back down. I looked at the clock. It was 10:30. The market had been open for an hour, and Thorne Dynamics was dead in the water. The execution was proceeding exactly according to schedule. The silence in the courtroom was not empty. It was heavy, pressurized, and vibrating with the kinetic energy of a controlled demolition. Julian was still gripping the railing of the witness stand, his knuckles white, his breath coming in short, ragged gasps. He looked like a man who had been punched in the gut and was trying to remember how to inhale. The revelation that I was the financier behind EB Holdings had stunned him, but he was still clinging to a shred of denial. He was still trying to rationalize it. I could see the gears turning behind his eyes. He was thinking that perhaps I had inherited money from a distant relative. He was thinking that perhaps I was just a lucky investor. He was still refusing to accept the fundamental truth of who I was. Judge Mercer decided that it was time to remove the blindfold permanently. She did not look at the gallery. She did not look at the court reporter. She locked her eyes on Julian, and the intensity of her gaze pinned him to the spot. She leaned forward over the bench, her black robe rustling like the wings of a crow. She picked up the file again, but this time, she did not open it. She simply rested her hand on the cover, as if she were swearing an oath on a holy book. "Mr. Thorne," Judge Mercer said, her voice dropping to a register that commanded absolute attention, "you have spent the last hour telling this court who your wife is not. You have told us she is not intelligent. You have told us she is not capable. You have told us she is an embarrassment." Julian opened his mouth to speak, perhaps to double down on his insults, but the judge held up a hand. "Do not interrupt me," she warned. "I am asking you a question that will determine the future of your company and your freedom." She paused, letting the tension ratchet up another notch. "You call her a disgrace, Mr. Thorne." But I must ask you again, do you really not know who she is? Julian blinked, sweat beading on his forehead. I do not understand the question. Your Honor, she is Ellen. She is my wife. She is a housewife. Judge Mercer shook her head slowly, a gesture of profound disappointment. Mr. Blackwood, the judge said, turning her attention to Julian's lawyer, you are a senior partner at a prestigious firm. You are paid a significant amount of money to perform due diligence. Blackwood was sitting very still. He was staring at the documents spread out on his table. Specifically, he was staring at the red folder that David had submitted into evidence. From where he sat, he could see the embossed gold seal on the top document. It was a seal he recognized. It was the seal of the United States Patent and Trademark Office. I watched the color drain from Blackwood's face. It started at his chin and moved up to his hairline until he looked like a wax figure. He knew. In that instant, he realized he had walked his client into a minefield without a metal detector. The judge picked up the document with the gold seal. She held it up high, facing the gallery, facing Julian. This, the judge announced, her voice ringing clear and sharp, is a certificate of registration. It pertains to a proprietary piece of software architecture known as the Oracle. Julian's eyes widened. That name. It was the holy grail of his empire. It was the name he whispered with reverence in interviews. It was the magic box that printed money. The Oracle is the heart of Thorne Dynamics, Julian said, his voice trembling slightly. It is my creation. It is my legacy. Is it? The judge asked. Because the United States government disagrees. She read from the document. Title of work: The Oracle Predictive Algorithm. Author: Ellen Vance. Date of creation: 10 years ago. She lowered the paper and looked at Julian. The copyright is not in your name, Mr. Thorne. It never was. It is in the name of your wife. The air was sucked out of the room. A collective gasp rose from the gallery. Reporters were on their feet, craning their necks. Sophia Vane, who had been standing, slowly sank back into her seat, her hand covering her mouth. Julian shook his head violently. No, that is a mistake. That is a clerical error. Ellen cannot code. She does not know a line of Python from a grocery list. He pointed at me, his fingers shaking with rage and desperation. Look at her, he shouted. She is a domestic creature. She bakes cookies. She organizes the linen closet. She is not a coder. She is barely literate in technology. I sat there, listening to him reduce my entire existence to domestic servitude. It was a fascinating study in cognitive dissonance. He had seen me at the computer. He had seen me working, but his ego was so massive, so fragile, that he had rewritten his own memories to protect it. He could not accept that the woman he treated like a servant was the architect of his godhood. Judge Mercer did not shout back. She simply picked up another piece of paper. Mr. Thorne, she said, her voice cutting through his hysteria. The court does not care about your opinion of your wife's domestic skills. The court cares about contracts. And this document here is a licensing agreement. She held it up. This agreement states that Ellen Vance granted Thorne Dynamics a limited, non-exclusive license to utilize the Oracle source code for commercial purposes. She paused, looking at the date at the bottom of the page. The term of this license was exactly 10 years. The judge continued. It was signed on the day of your wedding. Do you remember signing this? Mr. Thorne? Julian stared at the paper. He looked like he was trying to read a foreign language. I sign a lot of papers, he stammered. I thought it was a prenuptial thing. I thought it was about the house. You thought wrong, the judge said. You signed a lease on the very brain of your company, and like any lease, it has an expiration date. She looked at the calendar on the wall behind her. That expiration date was yesterday. The judge said. Julian froze. The implication hit him like a physical blow. If the license had expired, and he was still using the code, he was no longer a CEO. He was a pirate. He was operating a stolen engine. But surely Julian looked around the room, his eyes wild. Surely there is an automatic renewal clause? These things always renew. We have been using it for a decade. It is implied. Judge Mercer looked at David. Does the plaintiff wish to address the status of the renewal? The judge asked. David turned to me. He did not speak. He simply gestured for me to stand. I rose from my chair. My legs felt strong. The fatigue I had felt earlier was gone, replaced by a clarity that was sharp and cold as ice. I smoothed the fabric of my thrift store skirt. I adjusted my glasses. I looked at Julian. He was looking at me with a mixture of fear and pleading. For the first time, he was not looking at an embarrassment. He was looking at the person who held his life in her hands. He was begging me, with his eyes, to save him. He was begging me to be the submissive, helpful wife one last time. Ellen, he whispered, tell them we renewed it. I looked at him. I thought about the way he had dismissed me at the gala. I thought about Sophia laughing on my desk. I thought about Mr. Abernathy picking up his glasses from the floor. I thought about the $50,000 settlement he had offered me as an insult. I let a smile touch my lips. It was not a warm smile. It was the smile of a mathematician who had just solved a complex equation and found the result to be 0. I did not renew it. I said, my voice was soft, but in the silence of the courtroom, it sounded like a thunderclap. Julian flinched as if I had struck him. What? He gasped. I did not renew the license, I repeated, enunciating every word. As of midnight last night, Thorne Dynamics no longer has the legal right to execute the code. Every server running my algorithm is currently committing copyright infringement. Julian stared at me. His mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. His brain was trying to process the magnitude of the disaster. But it was too big. It was total system failure. Then, the sound began. It started as a single vibration, a buzz against a wooden table, then another, then a chime, then a ringtone. Julian's phone, which was sitting on the ledge of the witness stand, lit up. Then it started to vibrate violently, dancing across the wood. Sophia's phone in her purse began to ring. Blackwood's phone. The phones of the 3 reporters in the front row. It was a cacophony of digital alarms. Judge Mercer did not bang her gavel. She watched. Julian grabbed his phone. His hands were shaking so badly he almost dropped it. He stared at the screen. What is this? He whispered. A red notification banner was pulsing across the screen. It was not a text message. It was a system alert from the Thorne Dynamics Central Command app. System lockdown. Critical error. License invalid. Access denied. Julian swiped frantically at the screen. Nothing happened. He tried to open his email. Access denied. He tried to open the company dashboard. Access denied. No. He whimpered. No, no, no. From the gallery. A reporter shouted out, forgetting all courtroom protocol. The stock. Look at the stock. Julian looked up. On the back wall of the courtroom, there was a large monitor that had been used earlier to display evidence. Someone, likely David, had just switched the input to the Bloomberg financial news feed. The ticker for Thorne Dynamics, symbol TDYN, was prominent on the screen. It was flashing red. A bright, angry red arrow was pointing straight down. The numbers were tumbling. $100 a share, $80, $60, $40. It was a free fall. The market algorithms, sensing the sudden cessation of the company's core function and the legal news leaking from the courtroom, had triggered a mass sell-off. Julian watched his net worth evaporate in real time. Every second that passed wiped millions of dollars from his name. He turned to me. His face was a mask of horror. "Stop it!" he screamed. "Ellen, stop it! You are killing the company. You are destroying everything. I am not destroying anything. Julian," I said calmly, "I am simply taking back what is mine. You built your castle on my land, and now I am taking the land back." "My phone?" Sophia shrieked from the gallery. She was holding her device up. "It is locked. My credit cards are declining. I just got a notification from the bank." Of course her cards were declining. Her life was funded by the company accounts. And the company accounts were currently frozen by E.B. Holdings. Julian looked at Sophia. then back at the screen, then at me. The realization finally hit him in its entirety. It was not just a divorce, it was an erasure. He slumped against the witness stand. He looked like a puppet whose strings had been cut. "You cannot do this," he whispered, his voice cracking. "I am Julian Thorne. I am a visionary. You were a user interface. Julian," I said, "I was the operating system, and you just crashed." Judge Mercer watched the scene with a grim satisfaction. She looked at the flashing red screen, then down at Julian. "It appears, Mr. Thorne," the judge said, her voice cutting through the chaos, "that your wife is not quite the embarrassment you claimed she was. In fact, it seems she is the only reason you were ever relevant at all." Julian looked up at the judge. His eyes were empty. "She is a monster," he whispered. "No, Mr. Thorne," the judge replied. "She is a creditor. And she has come to collect." The stock price hit $10. Trading was halted by the exchange due to volatility. The graph on the screen flatlined. The room was in chaos, but I felt a profound sense of peace. I watched Julian Thorne, the man who had screamed at me for buying a book, the man who had called me stupid, the man who had erased me from his life. I watched him realize that without me, he was nothing but a man in a suit standing in a room full of people who now knew he was a fraud. I looked at David. "Are we done here?" I asked. David smiled. "Not quite," he said. "We still have to talk about the personal guarantee." Julian's head snapped up. "What?" he croaked. I turned back to him. "You didn't read the loan agreement." "Julian," I said, "you didn't read the IP license, and you certainly didn't read the personal guarantee clause in the EB Holdings contract." I took a step toward the witness stand. "I own the company, Julian." "But the debt? The $50 million? Since the company is now in default, that debt has transferred." "To whom?" Julian breathed. "To you." I said, "Personally." I pointed to the monitor where his stock was dead. "I hope you have some savings, Julian, because I am going to take everything else. The house, the cars, the yacht you were bragging about, even the watch on your wrist." Julian looked down at his Rolex. He covered it with his other hand. A pathetic, instinctive gesture of protection. "You are bluffing," he said weakly. "I do not bluff, Julian." I said, "I do mathematics, and the math says you are bankrupt." Judge Mercer picked up her gavel. "The court will take a 15-minute recess," she announced. "Mr. Blackwood, I suggest you use this time to explain to your client exactly how much trouble he is in. Although, looking at the stock market, I think the market has already delivered the verdict." She banged the gavel. The sound signaled the end of Julian Thorne. "And the beginning of Ellen Brookhart." "This is sabotage!" Julian screamed, his voice cracking with the strain. He slammed his hand against the witness stand. The wood vibrating under the impact. He pointed a trembling finger at me, his face a mask of twisted red rage. "She hacked the system. I demand a federal investigation. This woman is a domestic terrorist. She has manipulated the servers to make it look like the license expired. She has forged signatures. Arrest her." The courtroom was in an uproar, but it was a controlled chaos. The kind that happens when a disaster is so spectacular that no one wants to look away. Judge Mercer did not bang her gavel this time. She sat back, watching Julian unravel with the cold. Clinical detachment of a surgeon observing a patient fight the anesthesia. "Mr. Thorne, my lawyer, David," said calmly. His voice cut through Julian's hysteria not by volume, but by its utter lack of emotion. He walked to the center of the room, standing directly between Julian and me. He looked like a teacher waiting for a tantrum to subside. "It is not sabotage. Mr. Thorne," David continued, "it is contract law, and we are not done. I am not answering any more questions from you." Julian spat. "You are a fraud. Your client is a fraud. I am calling the CEO of EB Holdings right now. I am going to have you both disbarred and thrown in prison for corporate espionage." He reached for his phone again, forgetting that it was currently locked out of his own company's network. He tapped furiously at the screen, his movements jerky and uncoordinated. David waited. He let Julian struggle with the phone for a painful 10 seconds. "Mr. Thorne," David said, his voice dropping an octave. "Before you try to make that call, I need you to answer one simple question regarding the solvency of your company." "I am solvent," Julian yelled. "I have $50 million in the bank." "Do you?" David asked. "Or do you have $50 million of debt?" Julian froze. He looked up from his phone, his eyes narrowing. "It is an investment," Julian corrected him. Adopting a tone of condescending superiority, "It is a strategic partnership. Let us be precise," David said, pulling a document from his briefcase. He did not hand it to the judge. He held it in his own hands, reading from it like a town crier. "You signed a credit facility agreement with E.B. Holdings 3 months ago. The principal amount is $50 million. Is that correct?" "Yes," Julian snapped. "And you pledged all assets of Thorne Dynamics, as well as a personal guarantee, as collateral for this loan?" "Standard business practice." Julian scoffed. "It means nothing. They are my partners. They are my angel investors." "Angel investors," David repeated, testing the words on his tongue. "Yes, angels," Julian shouted, looking to the gallery as if seeking validation. "They saved the company when the American banks turned their backs on innovation. They are a prestigious Swiss firm. They understand vision. They believe in me. They believe in Julian Thorne." I watched him from my seat. It was almost pitiful. He was clinging to this fantasy of a benevolent savior, a faceless European entity that recognized his genius. He needed EB Holdings to be real. He needed them to be separate from me, because if they were not, his entire reality collapsed. David turned slowly to point at me. He did not point with a finger. He gestured with an open hand, as if introducing a performer on a stage. "Mr. Thorne," David said softly. "E.B. Julian blinked. "What?" "The name of the firm," David said. "E.B. Holdings. Have you never wondered what those initials stand for?" Julian looked at David. Then he looked at me. He shook his head, a nervous twitch developing in his left eye. "It stands for Equity and Banking, or something Swiss. Who cares?" David shook his head. "No, Mr. Thorne, it does not stand for equity and banking." David took a step back, leaving the line of sight between Julian and me perfectly clear. "E.B. stands for Ellen Brookhart." The sound that filled the room was not a gasp. It was a sudden, sharp intake of breath from 100 people at once. It was the sound of air leaving the room. Sophia Vane, who had been trying to make herself invisible in the second row, let out a small, strangled cry. Her face, which had been pale before, turned the color of ash. She brought a hand to her throat, her eyes widening until they looked like they might pop out of her head. She knew, in that second, she knew exactly where the money for her handbags, her shoes, and her Miami apartment had come from. Julian did not scream this time. He went deadly silent. He stared at me. He looked like a man trying to solve a puzzle that had missing pieces. "No," he whispered. "That is not funny." I stood up. I did not rush. I smoothed the wrinkles of my skirt. I picked up my glasses and cleaned them deliberately on the hem of my cardigan. I put them back on. I wanted him to see me clearly. I wanted him to see every line on my face, every gray hair he had mocked, every inch of the woman he had discarded. I walked toward the witness stand. The bailiff started to move toward me, but Judge Mercer held up a hand to stop him. She wanted to hear this. "I did not invest in you, Julian," I said. My voice was not loud, but in the silence of that courtroom, it carried like a bell. I stopped 5 feet away from him. "I bought you," I said. Julian gripped the railing. "You do not have $50 million. You are broke. I give you an allowance. I have earned millions of dollars over the last 10 years. Julian," I said, "while you were busy giving interviews and posing for magazines, I was ghost coding for the biggest firms in the valley. I invested every cent. I compounded it. And when you needed money, I was the one who provided it. I took a step closer. I am EB Holdings. I said, I am the chairman. I am the board. I am the shareholder. Julian looked at his lawyer. Blackwood was staring at the floor, refusing to meet his client's eyes. Blackwood, Julian rasped. Tell her she is lying. Blackwood did not look up. It is true. Julian, I checked the incorporation papers during the recess. It is her. It is all her. Julian looked back at me. His expression crumbled. The arrogance evaporated, leaving behind a naked, terrified child. Why? He whispered. Why would you do that? If you are the lender, then why are you calling the loan? Why are you destroying your own investment? I smiled. It was a cold, razor-sharp smile. Because of the contract. Julian, I turned to David. Clause 14b. Please. David flipped the document open. He cleared his throat. Clause 14. Subsection B. Titled, Reputational Covenants. David read. The borrower agrees that the reputation of the lender is a material asset. Therefore, if the chief executive officer of the borrower engages in any public conduct, speech, or action that disparages, insults, or otherwise causes harm to the personal or professional reputation of the lender or the lender's principals, such action shall constitute an event of default. David looked up. Upon such an event of default, the entire principal amount, plus all accrued interest and penalties, shall become immediately due and payable. I looked at Julian. He was shaking his head slowly, trying to process the legal language. I do not understand, he murmured. I never insulted EB Holdings. I praised them. I called them angels. I took a step closer, leaning in until I was almost whispering in his ear, though the microphone picked up every word. But you insulted Ellen Brookhart, I said. Julian's eyes widened. You called me a parasite, I listed, ticking the insults off on my fingers. You called me an embarrassment. You called me intellectually vacant. You called me a burden. I dropped my hand. I am the principal of EB Holdings, Julian. Every word you screamed in this courtroom 10 minutes ago? That was you, on public record, disparaging the lender. I leaned back, crossing my arms. You triggered the clause yourself. I said, you stood there, in your Italian suit, and you talked yourself into bankruptcy. You thought you were shaming your wife, but you were actually insulting your bank manager. The realization hit him like a physical blow. He staggered back, his legs hitting the chair. He collapsed into it, the air rushing out of his lungs. No, he wheezed. No, that is a trap. It is a contract. So I corrected him. A contract you signed. A contract you were too arrogant to read, because you were too busy planning your victory party with your mistress. I pointed to the gallery, to where Sophia was sitting. And speaking of expenses, I said, turning the knife. Sophia flinched as my eyes landed on her. You used the first tranche of the loan, my money, to buy a penthouse in Miami. I said, $5 million. You put it in a trust for Miss Vane. Julian looked at Sophia. He looked sick. David stepped forward. Actually, Mr. Thorne, under the terms of the general security agreement signed as part of the loan package, that apartment is considered after-acquired property purchased with loan proceeds. David smiled, a shark-like grin that mirrored my own. Since the loan is in default, the lender, Mrs. Thorne, has the right to seize all collateral. I looked at Sophia. I will be taking the apartment. Sophia, I said politely. And the car? And the jewelry? Sophia let out a sob. She looked down at the diamond bracelet on her wrist, a gift from Julian last week, and frantically tried to unclasp it, as if it were burning her skin. No, Julian shouted, finding his voice again. You cannot take her things. That is personal. It is business. Julian, I said, just business. Julian turned to Blackwood, grabbing the lawyer's arm. Do something. Fix this. File an injunction. Stop her. Blackwood finally looked at his client. His face was grim. There was no pity in his eyes, only the resignation of a man watching a train wreck. We are dead, Julian, Blackwood whispered, his voice caught by the microphone. The clause is ironclad. I have seen it. It is standard in high-risk venture capital. Although what? Julian demanded. Although I have never seen it weaponized like this, Blackwood admitted. You signed a personal guarantee. Julian, do you know what that means? Julian shook his head frantically. No, it means the company pays. No, Blackwood said, pulling his arm away from Julian's grip. It means that since the company has no cash, because the accounts are frozen and the stock has crashed, the debt passes to you. Blackwood pointed to the papers. Unlimited personal liability. Julian, it means she does not just own the company, she owns you. Julian looked at his hands. He looked at the courtroom. He looked at the judge, who was watching him with an expression that said, checkmate. He looked at me. $50 million, he whispered. I do not have $50 million liquid. I know. I said, but you have assets. I started listing them. My voice was calm, methodical, like an auctioneer calling out lots. The estate in the Hamptons, market value, $12 million. The penthouse in Tribeca, market value, $8 million. The collection of vintage Aston Martins, market value, $6 million. Julian's face twisted in pain with every item I named. The yacht. The Sophia, I said, emphasizing the name, market value, $10 million. I paused. That gets us to $36 million. Julian, you are still short. I looked at his wrist. Take off the watch. I said. Julian clutched his wrist, covering the gold Rolex. No, take it off. I repeated. It is a Patek Philippe Nautilus. You bought it last month with company funds. It is worth $120,000. It belongs to me. Julian looked at the judge. Your Honor, she is stripping me naked. Judge Mercer leaned forward. Mr. Thorne, the judge said, you came into this courtroom demanding that your wife be left with nothing. You stated that she deserved nothing. You stated that $50,000 was generous. The judge picked up her gavel. It appears that the tables have turned. If the contract is valid, and your own lawyer seems to think it is, then Mrs. Thorne is within her rights to exercise the collateral clauses. She looked at me. Proceed. Mrs. Thorne. I held out my hand. The watch. Julian. Julian looked at the bailiff. The bailiff did not move to help him. The bailiff was looking at me with something like respect, slowly, with shaking fingers. Julian unlatched the clasp of the watch. He slid it off his wrist. He held it for a moment, the gold catching the light, a symbol of the status he valued above all else. Then, he dropped it into my open palm. It was heavy. It felt cold. I closed my fingers around it. Thank you. I said, that pays off the interest for the last 12 hours. I turned to the gallery. I looked at Sophia. You are next, I said. Sophia burst into tears and buried her face in her hands. Julian slumped forward, his forehead hitting the wood of the witness stand. He began to sob. It was a dry, ugly sound. The master of the universe, the titan of tech, was crying in front of the people he had tried to impress. It is not fair, he sobbed into the wood. It is not fair. I looked down at the top of his head. Fairness is a concept for children. Julian, I said quietly, this is finance. I turned my back on him and walked back to my table. I sat down next to David. David leaned over. That was brutal. He whispered, it was necessary. I replied. I looked at the judge. Your Honor, I said, the plaintiff rests. The room remained silent, save for the sound of Julian Thorne weeping for the empire he had just lost. The courtroom had transformed into a theater of the absurd. Julian sat slumped in the witness chair, a broken man who had just handed over a watch worth more than most people earned in a decade. He was staring at his empty wrist, tracing the pale band of skin where the gold had been, as if trying to understand how his time had run out so quickly. But the silence did not last. It was shattered by the screech of a chair legs dragging across the floor. In the second row of the gallery, Sophia Vane stood up. She looked frantic. The cool, poised director of marketing who had smirked at my outfit earlier was gone. In her place was a terrified young woman who had just watched her future evaporate on a financial news ticker. She looked at Julian, who was weeping into his hands, and her expression twisted. It was not a look of concern. It was a look of pure, unadulterated self-preservation. "Your Honor!" Sophia shouted, her voice shrill and piercing. "I need to go on the record. I object to this. I object to everything." Judge Mercer looked up, her eyebrows raised. "Sit down, Miss Vane. This is a divorce hearing, not a town hall meeting. You are an observer." "No!" Sophia scrambled out of the row. Pushing past a startled reporter, she walked into the aisle, clutching her designer handbag like a shield. "I am not just an observer. I am a victim here. I need to clarify my position before she takes my apartment." She pointed a manicured finger at me. "I have nothing to do with his debts," Sophia screamed. "I am just an employee. I am a victim of workplace harassment." Julian's head snapped up. He looked at Sophia, blinking through his tears. "Sophia, what are you saying?" Sophia did not look at him. She looked solely at the judge, her eyes wide and pleading. "He forced me, Your Honor," she cried, the tears starting to flow with impressive speed. "Julian Thorne is a predator. He used his power as CEO to manipulate me. I was just a junior marketing associate. I wanted to keep my job. He threatened to fire me if I did not accompany him to dinners, if I did not accept his gifts. I was scared. I had student loans." The courtroom erupted in murmurs. This was a pivot so sharp it gave everyone whiplash. Julian stared at her, his mouth hanging open. "Forced you? Sophia, we are getting married in June. You picked out the flowers last week. You chose the orchids because they were imported from Thailand." "I was acting," Sophia yelled back at him, her voice cracking. "I was trying to survive. I never loved you. You are old and you are arrogant and you treat everyone like trash. I was terrified of you." She turned back to the judge, clasping her hands together in a prayer motion. "Please, Your Honor, do not let her take my apartment. Do not let her take my car. I did not know where the money came from. I thought he was rich. I am innocent. I am just a poor girl who got caught in his web." It was a magnificent performance. If I did not know better, I might have even felt a pang of sympathy. But I did know better. I knew everything. I looked at David. He was already reaching into his briefcase. He pulled out a binder, a blue one this time. "Your Honor," David said, his voice cutting through Sophia's hysterics. "If I may?" "Please," Judge Mercer said, leaning back. She looked like she was watching a particularly gripping soap opera. David walked over to the evidence table. He opened the binder and smoothed out the first page. "Miss Vane claims she was a victim of coercion," David said, addressing the room. "She claims she was ignorant of the source of the funds and that she was forced into a relationship with Mr. Thorne." David picked up a piece of paper. "I have here a transcript of a text message conversation between Miss Vane and Mr. Thorne, dated 6 months ago. This was retrieved from the company server. As it was sent using company devices," he adjusted his glasses and began to read. "Sender, Sophia Vane. Recipient, Julian Thorne. Timestamp, 2:30 in the afternoon." David cleared his throat and adopted a slightly higher pitch, mocking Sophia's tone. "Message. Hey baby, the auditors are asking about the invoice for the interior decorator. Should I tell them it was for the office lobby renovation? LOL." David looked up. Sophia froze. Her mouth, which had been open to scream more lies, snapped shut. "And the reply," David continued. "Sender, Julian Thorne. Message. Yeah, tell them it is for the executive lounge. Just make sure the invoice is under $5,000 so it does not trigger a review. Love you. Future Mrs. Thorne." David flipped the page. "And here is another one," he said, dated 2 months ago. Sender, Sophia Vane. Message. "I need $10,000 for the deposit on the wedding venue. Use the R&D budget again. Nobody checks that account. And hurry up. I want the gold package." The courtroom went deadly silent. The image of the innocent victim shattered instantly, replaced by the image of a greedy accomplice. Sophia's face turned a mottled red. "That is out of context," she stammered. "I was joking. It was banter." "Banter?" David asked. He picked up another document. "This is an email chain with the subject line, Project Runway. In this email, you, Miss Vane, provide a list of luxury items, handbags, shoes, jewelry, with direct links to purchase them, and right next to each item, you listed the specific corporate expense code that Mr. Thorne should use to hide the purchase. You suggested billing a Hermes Birkin bag as client retention gift." David looked at the judge. "Your Honor, this is not a romance gone wrong. This is a criminal conspiracy. Miss Vane was not a victim. She was the architect of the embezzlement. She directed Mr. Thorne on exactly how to steal funds from the company to finance her lifestyle." Sophia took a step back. She looked at the exit, measuring the distance. "It is a lie," she shrieked, though her voice lacked conviction. "Those are fake. You forged them." "They are digitally signed and time-stamped on the company server," David said calmly. "And since Mrs. Thorne owns the server, the chain of custody is pristine." Julian, who had been listening to this exchange in stunned silence, finally found his voice. He stood up slowly, leaning heavily on the railing. He looked at Sophia, the woman he had destroyed his marriage for, the woman he had stolen millions for, and he saw a stranger. "You knew?" Julian whispered. "You told me to use the R&D budget. I did not want to touch that account. You said it was safe." Sophia turned on him, baring her teeth like a cornered animal. "Shut up, Julian," she snapped. "You are the CEO. It is your job to know better. If you were stupid enough to listen to me, that is your problem. Do not drag me down with you." "I bought you a house," Julian said, his voice trembling. "I bought you a car. I left my wife for you." "You left your wife because you are a narcissist," Sophia yelled. "And I stayed with you because I thought you had money. But look at you now. You are nothing. You are crying in a courtroom like a baby. You are pathetic." The word hung in the air. Pathetic. Julian recoiled, as if she had slapped him. He looked at her with a mixture of horror and heartbreak, the facade of their great love story, the passionate affair that was supposed to be worth sacrificing everything for, dissolved into a puddle of greed and opportunism right before his eyes. I watched them from my table. It was a grotesque spectacle, but it was also a necessary one. This was the truth I had known for months. "Money," I said aloud. They both stopped and looked at me. The room was quiet enough that I did not need to shout. "My money," I clarified, standing up again. "That is the only thing that held you two together. It was the glue. It was the foundation. You did not have passion. Julian, you had a line of credit, and now that I have cut the card, the party is over." I looked at Sophia. "You are not a victim. Sophia, you are a thief, and you are not very good at it." Judge Mercer cleared her throat. The sound was ominous. "Mr. Blackwood," the judge said, "I assume you are aware of the legal implications of the evidence that has just been presented?" Blackwood nodded miserably. "Yes, Your Honor. Conspiracy to commit fraud, embezzlement, grand larceny." "Correct," the judge said. She looked at Sophia, then at Julian. "This is no longer just a civil matter regarding the division of assets," Judge Mercer announced sternly. "The evidence presented suggests significant criminal activity involving the misappropriation of corporate funds." She picked up a pen and began to write on a form. "I am ordering the court bailiff to detain both Mr. Thorne and Miss Vane. I am forwarding the transcript of this hearing, along with all submitted evidence, to the district attorney's office immediately. I am recommending that charges be filed for corporate fraud and embezzlement." Sophia let out a wail that sounded like a siren. "No, you cannot arrest me. I am a director. I have a reputation." "You have the right to remain silent," the judge said coldly. "I suggest you start exercising it." Two bailiffs moved forward. One approached Sophia, pulling a pair of handcuffs from his belt. The click of the metal locking around her wrists was loud and final. She struggled, kicking and screaming about her rights, about how it was all a mistake, about how she knew people in the Hamptons. Julian watched her being dragged away. He looked shell-shocked. He looked at the bailiff approaching him. Then, panic seized him, real, primal panic. He looked around the room for an exit. There was none. He looked at his lawyer. Blackwood turned his back on him, effectively resigning from the case in real time. Then, Julian looked at me. His eyes locked onto mine. In his mind, I was suddenly no longer the enemy. I was the safety net. I was the wife who had fixed his problems for 10 years. I was the one who had handled the taxes, the one who had smoothed over his social gaffes, the one who had always been there to catch him when he fell. He forgot about the insults. He forgot about the mistress. He just saw Ellen, the fixer. "Ellen!" he cried out. He lunged away from the witness stand. He stumbled toward my table, his arms outstretched. "Ellen, wait, please!" The bailiff grabbed his arm, but Julian wrenched himself free with a burst of hysterical strength. He ran 2 steps toward me before tripping over his own feet and crashing to his knees in the middle of the aisle. He scrambled forward on his knees, crawling toward me. His expensive suit was dusty. His face was streaked with tears and snot. He looked like a beggar. "Baby, please," he sobbed, reaching out a hand toward the hem of my skirt. "It is a misunderstanding. We can fix this. I was confused. She cast a spell on me. I never loved her. You know I only love you." I looked down at him. He was pathetic. He was disgusting. And he was the man I had wasted a decade on. "Ellen, listen to me," Julian pleaded, his voice rising to a shriek. "We are a team. You said it yourself. We built this. Just stop the lawsuit. Tell the bank it was a mistake. Unfreeze the accounts. We can go home. I will fire Sophia. I will buy you a new house. Anything you want. Just save me." He tried to grab my ankle. I took a step back, moving my foot out of his reach. "Save you?" I asked, my voice devoid of warmth. "Julian, I am the one who is drowning you." No, do not say that," he cried. "Remember the anniversary? Remember the trip to Paris? We were happy. We can be happy again. I made a mistake. A man is allowed 1 mistake. You made 1,000 mistakes. Julian," I said. "But your biggest mistake was thinking that I would always be there to clean up your mess." I looked at the bailiff who was now closing in on him. "Officer," I said, "please remove this man. He is disturbing my peace." The bailiff grabbed Julian by the shoulders and hauled him up. Julian kicked and flailed, his dignity completely gone. "Ellen, do not do this," he screamed as they dragged him backward. "I am your husband. You promised to have and to hold, till death do us part." "The marriage is dead. Julian," I shouted back, my voice finally rising, letting a fraction of my anger show. "And you killed it. No, no!" His screams echoed through the courtroom as they dragged him toward the side door. He was thrashing like a wild animal, begging, pleading, bargaining with a god he did not believe in. "I am rich. I am Julian Thorne. You cannot touch me. Ellen, Ellen!" The heavy oak door slammed shut, cutting off his voice. The silence that followed was heavy and ringing. I stood there, breathing deeply. My heart was pounding, not with fear, but with the adrenaline of the climax. I looked at the spot on the floor where he had crawled. There was a scuff mark on the carpet. Judge Mercer exhaled a long breath. She took off her glasses and rubbed her eyes. "In 30 years on the bench," the judge said, her voice weary but respectful, "I have never seen a dismantling quite like that." She looked at me. "Mrs. Thorne, or should I say, Miss Brookhart, are there any further motions?" I looked at David. He shook his head, a small smile playing on his lips. "No, Your Honor," I said. "I think we have covered everything." "Very well," the judge said. "I am granting the divorce on the grounds of adultery and cruelty. I am upholding the validity of the loan agreement and the collateral seizure. all assets of Thorne Dynamics and Mr. Thorne's personal estate are hereby transferred to the control of E.B. Holdings to satisfy the debt. She banged the gavel one last time. Court is adjourned. I gathered my files. I did not feel joy. I did not feel happiness. Those were light, fluffy emotions. What I felt was heavier, darker, and infinitely more satisfying. I felt balanced. The equation was finally resolved. The variable of Julian Thorne had been eliminated. I turned to walk out of the courtroom. The reporters were shouting questions at me, but I did not hear them. I walked down the center aisle, my head held high, my heels clicking a steady rhythm on the floor. I was walking out of a prison I had helped build, and the air outside had never tasted so sweet. The bailiffs had halted their removal of Julian just inside the double doors of the courtroom. The sudden outburst regarding his personal wealth had caused Judge Mercer to raise a hand, signaling them to pause. She wanted to hear this. She wanted the record to be complete. Julian, mistaking this pause for a reprieve, pulled himself free from the grip of the officer. He smoothed his ruined suit jacket, his hands trembling violently, and staggered back toward the center of the room. He was a man drowning, thrashing at the surface, desperate to find one piece of driftwood that would keep him afloat. "You cannot take everything," Julian gasped, his voice raw from screaming. He looked at me, his eyes burning with a manic intensity. He was trying to reconstruct his reality, brick by broken brick. "You have the company," he spat, wiping saliva from his chin. "Fine, take it. It is a shell now anyway. You crashed the stock. You ruined the reputation. It is worthless. But you cannot touch me. Not the real me." He turned to the gallery, addressing the few stunned reporters who were still recording. "I am Julian Thorne," he declared, his voice rising in pitch. "I made smart investments, personal investments. I have a villa in Tuscany that is in my name only. I have a collection of modern art stored in a free port in Geneva. I have gold bars in a vault in Singapore. That is my money, my private property." He turned back to me, a twisted grin forming on his tear-streaked face. "You can bankrupt Thorne Dynamics, Ellen, but you cannot bankrupt me. I will rebuild. I will start over, and I will still be rich while you are sitting in the ashes of the company you just destroyed. You forgot about the corporate veil, didn't you? The limited liability?" He laughed. It was a jagged, hysterical sound. "I am still a king, Ellen, and you are just a bitter ex-wife with a worthless contract." I watched him. I felt absolutely nothing. No anger, no pity. Just the cold, mathematical certainty of the outcome. He was playing checkers. I had been playing three-dimensional chess for 6 months. I did not shout. I did not move toward him. I simply reached into my leather briefcase and pulled out a single sheet of paper. It was the final page of the loan agreement, the page he had signed with such flourish, the page he had not even glanced at because he was too busy mocking the name of the holding company. "Julian," I said softly. My voice carried across the silent courtroom, absorbing all the oxygen in the room. "You really should have read page 42. Julian blinked. "Page 42? I held the paper up. It was dense with text, but 3 words at the top were bolded and capitalized. Unlimited personal guarantee. "You seem to be laboring under a delusion," I continued, my tone conversational, as if I were explaining a simple error in a grocery bill. "You believe that your personal assets are shielded by the corporate structure. Under normal circumstances, you would be right, but these are not normal circumstances." I walked slowly toward the bench, handing the document to the clerk, who passed it up to Judge Mercer. "In order to secure the $50 million from EB Holdings, a sum you were desperate for because no legitimate bank would touch you, you agreed to a specific set of collateral terms," I explained. Julian shook his head. "No, I signed a standard guarantee. It covers my shares in the company. That is all." I looked at him with genuine curiosity. How could a man be so arrogant and so blind simultaneously? "No, Julian," I said, "that is what you thought you signed. But this is what you actually signed." I turned to David. "Read the asset schedule, please." David stood up. adjusting his glasses. He picked up his copy of the document and began to read. His voice was monotone, a dull drumbeat of doom. The guarantor, Julian Thorne, hereby pledges as collateral for the loan the entirety of his personal estate, wheresoever situated, including but not limited to, David looked up at Julian, real estate holdings in the United States and abroad, specifically identifying the property in Tuscany, Italy. Julian's face went white. No, he whispered, maritime vessels, specifically identifying the yacht registered as the Sophia. David continued. Julian gripped the back of a chair to steady himself. Automobiles, fine art collections, precious metals, and all securities held in personal or offshore accounts, including the trust administered in Singapore. David read on. He paused, then delivered the final blow, and all future earnings, inheritances, and intellectual property rights acquired by the guarantor for a period of 50 years. The silence that followed was absolute. 50 years. I had not just taken his past and his present, I had mortgaged his future. I owned him until he was 85 years old. Julian looked at the judge. He looked like a child who had just been told that Santa Claus had died. Your Honor, he croaked, that is slavery. That cannot be legal. Judge Mercer was reading the document through her spectacles. She traced the lines of text with her finger. She checked the signature at the bottom. It was Julian's signature. It was bold, confident, and utterly damning. She looked down at Julian. Her expression was not sympathetic. It was final. Mr. Thorne, the judge said, you are a sophisticated businessman. You have run a multinational corporation for a decade. The court assumes that when you sign a contract, you understand the terms. But I did not read it, Julian screamed, losing all control. I trusted my lawyer. I trusted the bank. You trusted your own arrogance, the judge corrected him sharply. This document is notarized. It is witness verified, and it is explicit. You waived your right to limited liability in exchange for the capital injection. You bet your life on this loan, Mr. Thorne, and you lost. She turned to me. Ms. Brookhart, are you moving to enforce the guarantee? I looked at Julian. He was shaking his head, mouthing the word no over and over again. Yes, Your Honor, I said. I am activating the seizure clause immediately. I turned to Julian. I want the villa. Julian, I want the art. I want the gold in Singapore. I want the clothes in your closet. I want the contents of your wallet right now. Julian fell to his knees. It was not a theatrical fall this time. His legs simply gave out. He slumped against the floor, a puddle of expensive fabric and broken ego. You are leaving me with nothing, he sobbed. Nothing. I will be on the street. I walked over to him. I stood over him, looking down at the top of his head where his hair was thinning, a detail he tried so hard to hide with expensive products. Do you remember what you said to me this morning? I asked him. He did not answer. He just cried. You stood on that stand, and you told the world that I was a burden. I reminded him. You said I was a parasite. You said I contributed nothing. You said I should be grateful for $50,000. I leaned down, my voice dropping to a whisper that only he in the front row could hear. You called me an embarrassment. Julian. He looked up at me. His eyes were red, swollen, and filled with a terror so deep it looked like madness. I am sorry, he whispered. Ellen, I am sorry. I straightened up. I looked at the judge. I looked at the gallery. I looked at the wreckage of the man who had once made me feel small. No, Julian, I said, I am not an embarrassment. I gestured to the room, to the lawyers, to the bailiffs, to the documents that proved I owned every single thing he had ever touched. I am your creditor. The words hung in the air, sharp and heavy as a guillotine blade. It was the ultimate redefinition of our relationship. I was no longer the wife. I was the institution to which he owed his existence. Judge Mercer raised her gavel. It looked heavy in her hand, an instrument of judgment that was about to sever the last thread of Julian's life. The court finds in favor of the plaintiff, the judge announced. Her voice boomed through the room. The motion for immediate asset seizure is granted. The freezing orders are effective immediately. All assets of Julian Thorne are hereby placed under the receivership of EB Holdings. She looked at Julian. Mr. Thorne, you are ordered to surrender your passport and remain within the jurisdiction until the asset transfer is complete. You are to vacate all properties currently listed in your name by 5 o'clock this afternoon. Julian let out a low moan, a sound of pure despair. 5 o'clock, he whispered. Where will I go? That is not the court's concern. The judge said. She brought the gavel down. Bang. The sound was final. It was the period at the end of a long, painful sentence. Case closed. The judge declared. The spell broke. The courtroom erupted into noise again. The reporters were shouting questions, flashing their cameras. The bailiffs moved in. This time with purpose. They grabbed Julian by the arms. He did not fight them. He was limp, a dead weight. He looked at me one last time as they hauled him up. His eyes were empty. The light behind them had gone out. He was not Julian Thorne, the CEO. He was not Julian Thorne, the husband. He was just a man with a negative net worth and a broken heart. Ellen, he whispered, what have you done? I looked at him, and for the first time in months, I felt the corners of my mouth turn up in a genuine smile. It was not a smile of cruelty. It was a smile of liberation. I balanced the books. Julian, I said, they dragged him away. He did not scream this time. He did not beg. He just stared at me as the distance between us grew, his figure getting smaller and smaller until the heavy oak doors swallowed him whole. I stood alone in the center of the room. The air was cool. The scent of his sandalwood cologne was fading, replaced by the smell of old paper and justice. David began packing up our files. He closed the blue binder with a satisfying snap. Well, David said, looking at the empty witness stand. That went well. I looked at the clock on the wall. It was 11 o'clock. The market was still halted. My phone was buzzing with messages from Marcus. The transfer protocols were already running. By the time the sun set, I would control everything. I picked up my canvas tote bag, the one Julian had mocked. I placed the Patek Philippe watch inside it. It clinked against my keys. Come on. David, I said. Where are we going? He asked. I looked toward the door, toward the future that was finally, truly mine. I have a company to rename, I said, and I believe there is a penthouse in Tribeca that needs to be cleared of trash. I turned and walked down the aisle. I did not look back. There was nothing behind me but ghosts and bad debts, and I had already written them off. The heavy oak doors of the courtroom swung open, but not for me. They opened to admit 4 officers from the U.S. Marshal Service. They moved with the heavy, inevitable momentum of a glacier. They were not there to escort a dignitary. They were there to secure an asset. And in the eyes of the law, Julian Thorne was no longer a man. He was a flight risk. He was a walking liability attached to a bankruptcy case that involved allegations of massive corporate fraud. I stood by my table, packing my canvas tote bag. I placed my notepad inside. I placed the cheap ballpoint pen I had used to sign the affidavit inside. My movements were slow and deliberate. I wanted to remember this. I wanted to imprint the sound of Julian's destruction into my memory, not out of cruelty, but out of necessity. I needed to remember exactly what happens when you underestimate the person who holds up your world. Julian was still on the floor where the bailiffs had dragged him. He was trying to stand, but his legs seemed to have forgotten how to work. The marshals surrounded him. One of them, a tall man with a buzz cut, placed a hand on Julian's shoulder. It was not a gentle touch. It was a grip that said, "You are property of the state now." "Mr. Thorne," the marshal said, his voice flat and bored. "We have a warrant to secure your person pending the asset liquidation hearing. You are coming with us." Julian looked at the marshal. Then he looked past him. He was scanning the room, his eyes darting frantically. He was looking for a savior. He was looking for the audience that had applauded him for 10 years, but the audience was gone. The investors had fled. The mistress was in handcuffs. The lawyer was packing his bag. Julian's eyes landed on me. "Ellen!" he screamed. The sound tore through the dignified air of the courtroom. It was a raw, animal noise. "Ellen, tell them. Tell them who I am." I zipped up my bag. The sound of the zipper closing was small, but to me, it sounded like a heavy steel door slamming shut. I did not look at him. I did not turn my head. I focused on the grain of the wooden table in front of me. I focused on the dust motes dancing in the shaft of light coming from the high windows. "Ellen, do not turn your back on me!" Julian howled as the marshals hoisted him to his feet. "I made you. You are nothing without me. Look at me." He was still trying to command me, even as he was being dragged away to a holding cell. Even as he lost every dollar to his name, he still believed he had the right to my attention. He still thought his voice was the most important sound in my universe. He was wrong. To me, his voice was now just background noise, like the hum of a refrigerator or the distant wail of a siren. It was irrelevant. I turned to David. My lawyer was stacking his files into neat piles. He looked tired but satisfied. "Good work." "David," I said quietly. David looked up and smiled. It was a genuine smile, the kind that reached his eyes. "It was a pleasure. Ms. Brookhart," he said. He emphasized my maiden name. It sounded strange to my ears, unused for a decade, but it also sounded clean. It sounded like fresh laundry. I looked over at the defense table. Mr. Blackwood, the high-priced shark who had sneered at my thrift store clothes, was snapping his briefcase shut. He did not look at Julian. He did not look at the marshals dragging his client out the side door. He was already checking his watch, calculating how much billable time he had lost on a client who could no longer pay him. Mr. Blackwood caught my eye. For a second, I thought he might say something. Perhaps an apology, perhaps a threat, but he just looked at me with a hollow, fearful expression. He nodded once, a stiff, jerky motion, and then turned on his heel. He walked out of the courtroom fast, almost running, like a rat sensing the ship had finally slipped beneath the waves. Julian's screams faded as the side door swallowed him. "I am sorry. I love you. Ellen." And then, silence. The room was empty of his ego. The air felt lighter. I took a deep breath, filling my lungs with oxygen that did not taste of sandalwood and lies. I walked down the center aisle. The few remaining reporters in the gallery stood up as I passed. They had their phones out, recording. They looked hungry. They wanted a quote. They wanted the tearful victory speech of the scorned wife. They wanted me to pump my fist or cry tears of joy. I gave them nothing. I kept my face impassive. I looked straight ahead, focusing on the double doors at the back of the room. I was not a character in their soap opera. I was the writer of the ending, and I had already put down the pen. I pushed the doors open and stepped out into the hallway. The marble corridor of the Supreme Court was cool and echoing. I walked past the statues of Lady Justice, past the portraits of dead judges. I walked out the front entrance and into the bright, blinding sunlight of a New York afternoon. The steps of the courthouse were crowded. Word had spread. The halting of the stock, the arrest of the CEO, the collapse of a tech giant. It was the story of the day. A swarm of microphones and cameras waited at the bottom of the stairs. "Mrs. Thorne, Mrs. Thorne, is it true you own the company? Did you plan this from the beginning? What will happen to the employees? Are you going to sell the algorithm?" The questions came at me like a wall of sound. I put on my sunglasses. They were cheap plastic frames I had bought at a drugstore, but they shielded my eyes just as well as Julian's designer shades ever had. I walked down the steps. I did not stop. I did not slow down. A reporter from CNBC thrust a microphone into my face. "Mrs. Thorne, just one word. How do you feel?" I stopped for a fraction of a second. I looked at the reporter. "Solvent," I said. I pushed past him and continued walking. My car was parked 3 blocks away. It was a 10-year-old sedan with a dent in the rear bumper and paint that was peeling on the hood. Julian had hated this car. He had refused to ride in it. He said it made us look poor. He had offered to buy me a Mercedes, a Porsche, anything to fit the image. I had refused. I liked this car. It was reliable. It was paid for. And most importantly, it was mine. I reached the street corner. The traffic was heavy, the usual midday gridlock of yellow taxis and delivery trucks, and then I saw it. Parked in a loading zone across the street was a massive flatbed truck. It was a commercial disposal vehicle. On the back of the truck, strapped down with heavy orange chains, were large, chrome letters, THORNE. It was the signage from the top of the headquarters building. The letters were taller than a man. They were gleaming in the sun, but they were lying flat, piled on top of each other like scrap metal. The demolition crew I had hired through the shell company had worked fast. They had stripped his name from the skyline before the verdict had even been read. I stood there on the sidewalk, watching the truck. A man in a high-visibility vest walked around the back, checking the straps. He slapped the letter R with his gloved hand, testing the tension. "Hey," he shouted to the driver. "It is secure. Let us take this junk to the crusher." The driver honked the horn. The truck groaned into gear and pulled away from the curb. I watched the name Thorne Dynamics disintegrate into a jumble of metal as the truck turned the corner and disappeared into the city traffic. It was gone. The empire was not just conquered. It was erased. I unlocked my car door and slid into the driver's seat. The fabric was worn. The steering wheel was hot from the sun. The car smelled of old coffee and vanilla air freshener. It smelled like home. I took my phone out of my bag. It was an old model. The screen cracked in the corner. I dialed a number that was not saved in my contacts, a number I had memorized. It rang once. "Yes?" A voice answered. It was Marcus. I watched a pigeon peck at a discarded crust of bread on the sidewalk. "It is done," I said. There was a pause on the other end. "Did you get everything?" Marcus asked. "Everything," I replied. "The assets are secured. The transfer orders are signed. Julian is in custody. And the company?" Marcus asked. I took a breath. "Activate the Phoenix Protocol," I said. My voice was steady. "Effective immediately." "Understood," Marcus said. "I have the press release ready. We are rebranding at 9 o'clock tomorrow morning. Change the name," I instructed. "It is no longer Thorne Dynamics." "What is the new name?" Marcus asked, though he already knew the answer. "Brookhart Systems," I said. "And the board of directors?" "Fire them," I said. "All of them. Every single person who sat at that table and laughed at Julian's jokes while he stole from the company. Every person who ignored the audit reports. Every person who treated me like a piece of furniture at the holiday parties. Get rid of them. And replace them with whom?" "I have a list," I said. "I have been compiling it for 6 months. Engineers, real engineers, people who care about the code. Not the stock price, people who work in the dark. Hire them. Give them equity. Very good." "Ms. Brookhart," Marcus said. "Welcome back to the game." "I am not back in the game, Marcus," I said. "I own the board." I hung up the phone. I tossed it onto the passenger seat. I sat there for a moment, gripping the steering wheel. My hands were bare. No, that was not right. My left hand still had a weight on it, a small, cold band of gold that felt like a shackle. I looked at my left hand. The wedding ring sat on my finger. It was a simple band. Julian had not bought me a diamond. He had said diamonds were a waste of capital in the early days. He had promised to upgrade it later. He never did. I twisted the ring. It was tight. It had been on my finger for 10 years. It had left an indentation in my skin. A pale groove where the sun had not touched me. I pulled. It resisted for a moment, clinging to me like a bad memory. Then, with a sudden slip, it came free. My finger felt light. It felt naked, but in a good way. It felt like taking off a pair of shoes that were 2 sizes too small after a long day of walking. I held the ring up. It caught the sunlight coming through the windshield. It looked cheap. It looked like a piece of wire. I looked at the center console of the car. There was a small cup holder filled with loose change, quarters for the parking meter, a few pennies, a stray paperclip. I dropped the ring into the cup holder. It made a small clink as it hit a quarter. It settled there among the loose change. It was not a sacred object. It was not a symbol of eternal love. It was just a piece of metal, worth perhaps $50 at a pawn shop. I would leave it there. Maybe I would use it to buy a coffee one day. Or maybe I would just leave it for the next owner of the car. I put the car in drive. I pulled out into the traffic. I merged with the flow of taxis and buses. No one looked at me. No one knew that the woman in the dented sedan had just taken down a billionaire. To them, I was just another driver, another face in the crowd, and that was exactly what I wanted. I turned on the radio. A pop song was playing, something loud and cheerful. I turned it down. I preferred the sound of the engine. I drove past the park. I drove past the expensive restaurants where Julian used to take Sophia. I felt no anger. The anger had been fuel, and the tank was empty now. I had burned it all to get here. Now, there was just peace, the kind of peace that comes after a long, feverish illness breaks. The fever was gone. The infection had been cut out. I was 40 years old. I had $50 million in the bank. I had a company to run. I had a code to rewrite. I looked in the rearview mirror. The courthouse was shrinking behind me, a gray block of stone disappearing into the haze of the city. I did not see Julian's face in the mirror. I saw my own. I saw lines around my eyes. Yes, I saw gray in my hair, but I also saw eyes that were clear and sharp. I saw a mouth that was not set in a grim line of endurance, but relaxed. I was Ellen Brookhart. I was a mathematician. I was a CEO. And for the first time in 10 years, I was free. I turned the corner, heading toward the bridge, heading toward the open road, the screen of my life, which had been frozen on a tragedy for so long, finally faded to black. Thank you so much for listening to this story of justice and reclamation. I hope you enjoyed Ellen's journey from silence to power. I would love to know where you are tuning in from today. Please leave a comment below with your city or country, and let's share our thoughts on the story. If you enjoyed this video, please make sure to subscribe to the channel Sweet Rose Drama, like the video, and hit that hype button to help this story reach even more people who might need a reminder that it is never too late to rewrite your own ending. See you in the next story.